This meeting is called to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of our great country. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is a public forum, 5 minutes per item maximum. We would like to welcome members of the public who have taken the time to attend this meeting and provide comments on matters related to business, district business. Any member of the public may address the board relating to any member within the board's jurisdiction. This need not be related to any item on the agenda. However, the board cannot act on an item unless it was noticed on the agenda. Persons speaking during the public comment will be limited to 5 minutes, or depending on the number of persons wishing to speak, it may be reduced to allow all members of the public the opportunity to address the board. Is there any member of the public that would like to address the board? You're not a member of the public. Okay. Pardon?
Thanks for asking.
You're welcome. Did I do it right? Okay, cool. Okay, we're into regular business. The first item is approval of Tuolumne Utility District Board of Directors' response to Ron Ring and Union Democrat article. I think we probably all read. Oh, go ahead.
Consent calendar.
No,
See,
Barbara,
Larry,
you're
I
on
knew
the
I'd
wrong
mess
agenda.
up. I don't see it here.
My bad. Sorry.
I thought I'd messed up. First, I thought I'd done it perfect, and now then you really messed me up.
All right.
No problemo. I appreciate you staying very astute and on top of this stuff, though.
Okay.
So, are we ready to move on to the Ron Ring and Union Democrat article? I think we've all read the letter, and I was kind of surprised that Ron took a kind of an attack stance against the person the county decided is their fire chief. And I think it's kind of a slap in the face to the Board of Supervisors, too, but I'll leave that up to your discretion and discussion, so it's open for discussion. With that, I'd recommend that we approve the letter.
I'll make that motion.
Okay. Then regularly moved and seconded that we approve the motion to send a letter regarding Ron Ring and Union Democrat article to the Union Democrat as a response. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
And I could you have asked? I mean, I was starting to raise my hand for a
I'm sorry.
discussion piece. Only I wasn't assertive enough, I guess. How can we do this? Maybe during the motion and ask if there's any further discussion. Is that possible to back the meeting?
I thought I did, but maybe I didn't.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll just go ahead and abstain on this because I had some points to discuss for your letter.
Okay. Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
No?
No.
Motion's carried. Next issue is workshop to present FYI 20 operating budget.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the board, this is the first budget workshop for your FY 19-20 budget. As we have embarked on this process since January, we've had a half a dozen workshops working through the strategic plan that identified the priorities of the district. We've identified goals and objectives. It's been very dynamic and interactive. I think it's been a good, healthy process. Hopefully through the strategic planning process, your board feels strongly that you have a good sense of our mission, our vision, and priorities for this upcoming year and years ahead. It really helps shape ultimately what we're doing here in the budget. It was the first step on the ladder toward your adopted budget. And then during the months of March, April, we went beyond strategic planning to talk about in capital improvement planning. As you know, there was a 5-year CIP that was first adopted in 2015 as part of your 5-year rate plan. We're now in the fourth, or we're moving into the last year of that process. And You heard a report about all the capital improvements that have occurred over the last 4 years. We're, for the most part, on target. We're behind on the Phoenix Lake Restoration Project, but not out of determination by TUD, but because of permitting issues that we're still trying to struggle and work through, and we're hoping to be successful, but I can't tell you 100% that we will be. It's a tough road to work through all the permitting issues. But you did get an update to your capital improvement plan. I think that was a very good discussion. I hear this almost every day from Don Perkins, and I'm glad he is always has boundless energy in reminding me about the failure of our water storage tanks and all the issues that our field crews are facing out there day by day. We really do have some major CIP needs. Basically, what you've heard is we have $70 million in deferred CIP. I would argue I could spend $200 million right now, and that includes the consolidation of the regional water treatment plants. I think that's a huge need. It will take a lot of heat off of our staff and improve the efficiency and reliability, especially as it relates to the potential for catastrophic fire that we're all talking about. And I'm glad the county and everyone is talking about it. It's huge. But for us, it's water supply reliability, and it's how do we provide that. And that comes from how we operate our watershed and the water supply facilities with PG&E, but it's also how we operate our water treatment plants and our storage tanks and our ditch conveyance systems. And so a lot of that is captured in our CIP. But the regional water treatment plants are important. So is potentially a pipeline from New Melones to Sonora. There's probably another 8 to 10 million. So when we talk, and another item we did include in the CIP was the regional wastewater treatment plant upgrade. That's a huge need. We start adding those costs on top of the 70 million, and Don emailed me the new regional water treatment plant that's in design right now is starting to peak $30 million. Times two, that's 60. You add a transmission line connected to Maloney's, that's 70. You add the regional water treatment plant upgrade project, that's another, I'm just going to round up. We're using very round numbers, another 20, that's 90. Piping certain sections to minimize the risk of fire on our water supply to the regional treatment plants like Sierra Pines, probably another 10. I mean, we're easily up to 100 million, and that's in addition to the 70. So when I say 200 million, not too far off. And then we're talking to PG&E. What does ultimate ownership of our water supply facilities look like? We're still working through that. I can't tell you an exact number, but there are some serious financial needs that this district has to ensure water supply reliability and that we're flexible and adaptive to the future, especially this upcoming summer fire season with PG&E's public safety power shutoff program. Right now, we know we don't have enough generators, and we're identifying those critical facilities. How can we make sure there's generators for each and every single one of those critical sites? People can do without power for a couple of days. It's an inconvenience, but they can't do without water. And we're going to make sure that we can ensure 100% water supply reliability when our ratepayers turn their taps on. It's good for them, it's good for you as the board, it's good for Tuolumne County as a region. But we have some real needs that we're facing, and each one of those generators, you're probably looking at $20,000 to $40,000 each. It's not cheap. It's an expensive system to operate, and we do have a good plan for moving forward. So what you're seeing today is really your first cut at what staff is recommending for this upcoming fiscal year and beyond, but we're focusing on the next fiscal year. So there's been a lot of work that has brought us to this date. Staff has had a lot of input. The management teams had a lot of input. It's been interactive, and what you're going to see today is a very good summary of what we're recommending for this upcoming fiscal year. And I know I've been a bit doom and gloom during this half a year, but it's not because there's not reason. There are a lot of doom and gloom stories out there. You guys are aware of them. You've heard them from me. And today there is a tough message that you're going to see presented to you. We're about $4 million over budget. We're not coming here before you and saying we've got a balanced budget. This is going to be easy and let's just move on. It's not, there's just too many needs. And so, yeah, we have a tough message. We're about 4 million over, and we don't have easy answers for you about how we're going to balance this budget. I hear this isn't the first time you've had staff present a budget that's over or expenses exceed revenue. We do have some ideas about how we might pare the budget down, which has already been done. We've had management go through the operations and maintenance side and really try to whittle away at the expenses exceeding revenues. But at the end of the day, we're still over. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to highlight what some of those big knobs are and how we think we can get through this upcoming fiscal year. We had a all-hands staff meeting this morning, and we went through an overview of the budget to staff, so they're aware of where we're at. And where we're at is not pretty. I wish it was easier, and I wish I could say we have more money than need. But the reality is we have way more need than we have money. So the question is, how do we keep our eye on the ball? How are we going to focus on the priorities? And how are we going to keep chipping away at this deferred CIP to bring the best level of service to the ratepayers, which I know your board wants to do. That's our strategic plan. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Steve, who's got a series of slides that's going to highlight where we're at, and then we'll get into a discussion about how your board would like to proceed dealing with the budget shortfall. So with that.
Good morning, everyone. Steve Sheffield, your finance director. I want to lead off with, last month at the board, I gave you a kind of a governmental 101 with our financials. And as Ed said, it was pretty thorough. I want to assure you today is not that. What today we've designed for you is to have a discussion. I don't want to just give you numbers. I want your input. I want your understanding. Some of you have been through a number of budget processes. Jeff, probably your first time through our budget process. So in working with Ed and designing this presentation, it's really geared towards just that, being a discussion. Of course, there's some education along the way as to how we've done this, what assumptions we've made, where we're at. But again, I would ask you, feel free to stop me at any time. Really what we want to come out of here is to give the board the opportunity for input, to help us with the board's priorities and directions. And like Ed said, we took the strategic plan, and that was the starting point for this budget. We also had adopted a 2-year budget previously. So we started with our adopted 2020 budget. The process for us internally is, first and foremost, we need to analyze revenues. And we look at the revenues, and then we go on to all the various operating expenses. And then Eric and Don, everybody has been working on the CIP, look at the assumptions, look at the best knowledge we have going forward. And so that's kind of our starting point. And that's what we've been doing for several months now, really. So with that said, the key areas I want to cover today with all of you are these 8 up here. And like I said, we have revenues, we have labor, operations and maintenance, CIP. We're going to talk a little bit about the rate study, talk about reserves, and then an overall summary or recap of what it looks like. And finally, I call it alternatives, options, choices, decisions, whatever. And that's where it's going to be more brainstorming than say, here's what we need to do or how we do it. So the first area, like I mentioned before, is the revenues. And, the primary revenues for TUD are essentially service charges, property taxes, debt service recovery, facilities, capital charges, and other income. Our best projection is the district anticipates realizing approximately $16.4 million in annual water revenue and approximately $7.1 million in annual sewer revenue, for a combined total of $23.5 million. Our approach to revenue budgeting is to really look at historical consumption over the last 8 to 10 years, look at the current year. We started off using through December 31st and projecting that, and then taking into account any scheduled increases. Part of the rate study was a 5-year incremental program. We have one more that's scheduled to go into effect January 1st of 2020. So these numbers up here take all of that into account. I think it's important to note that we did not try to go into any kind of hydrological modeling, future forecasting. And by that, what I mean is that we found over the last several years since the drought that people have essentially changed their usage. People have not gone back to the same level of usage. So I'm not anticipating next year, hey, our consumption is going to go way up because people are going to use a lot of water. It's going to be a hot summer and everything else. We're basing on probably we're going to have another year like we did last year. And so that's kind of a key factor in here as well. On the same token, we're really not looking at, magically Tuolumne County is not going to double in size. Okay, so, we've looked at historical growth patterns, tried to take that into account. So this is kind of our best projection at the time. As far as labor, consistent with the type of service TUD provides, the primary uses of expenses in the district budget are personnel related, first and foremost, salaries and benefits, materials and services. Total labor related budget expenditures for 2020 are budgeted at $11.6 million. In fiscal year 20, the district is not proposing any additional positions being added. This budget was prepared by analyzing each employee as they stand right now and forecasting all the related factors, including overtime, step increases, workers' comp, and the other insurance rates. If you look at the labor makeup, the $11.6 million, essentially right now, 59 in the budget, 59% is related strictly to the gross wages, if you will. Insurance is mainly health insurance, but also includes workers' comp and some of the disability and the other ones we pay. PERS would be our retirement plan. So you can see there insurance is 17% of the total. PERS is 13%. Retiree health, this number actually represents what we refer to as pay-go. Those are existing employees that are retired right now where we're paying their health insurance for them. There's also a component that's included in the fringe for the people who are working now that will qualify to have this benefit as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Taxes, employer taxes make up 5%. And then other is uniforms and meals, pretty low number in terms of the total. Ron.
So has there been any measurable decrease that you've been able to identify in overtime? Because we've done TUD has tackled some really big, nasty projects that have, upgraded some areas that were problem areas. Has this helped? Well, I know it's helped, but I mean, as far as, is there any measurable decrease in overtime?
Complicated answer, but I think the short answer is no measurable decrease. Maybe even if we were to take the time to really analyze it, maybe even a slight increase. However, by department, we have, historically up until, recently, we've spent a lot of money in water treatment, right? We've upgraded treatment plants like Columbia, Tuolumne. We have a new Monte Grande, a new Big Hill. We did away with the old plants. We also consolidated Willow Springs, which was a nightmare. We did an intertie between Big Hill and Columbia, so when there's a problem, we can simply turn this intertie on and not go out on overtime. We did spend, and so there, I can assure you there's a very measurable decrease in overtime there. However, on the other side, the distribution side, not so much. It has just steadily increased. We just have not spent the same kind of energy or money in our distribution system as we did on our water treatment.
So it's basically what's causing this is the bad pipes in the ground, the old stuff. That's what's causing
That's what's causing me not to give you a positive yes, there's a measurable decrease.
Okay, thank you.
And I guess I could tie into that too. You know, the purpose of these first slides is just to kind of show you all the components, you know, what makes this up before we get kind of the summary. But I also brought along our detail sheets, which, you know, there's dozens and dozens of those. If we wanted to drill down, but, you know, if you were to look at our labor budget, the overtime is not a huge number. You know, if we're looking at that $7 million of labor, I don't want to venture what it is, but it's not like 25% of it's overtime. Yes, overtime's still a big number, but Don's been working with us on the payroll side to get him number of call-outs, overtime incurred. And so we have been tracking it and looking at it for a while, but you know, part of the problem is, as you all know, is that we can't really anticipate where the next break is. Sure. You know, and so it's easy to say, well, geez, if we just fixed all of Willow Springs, it'd really go down. Well, hopefully it would, but it's going to take us a long time to get there to see those results. You know, and we're going to get there, but in the meantime, something else might pop up, you know, that it always does. But I just wanted to add to it. It's not as if, you know, $2 million is overtime. And again, later on, as we get further along, if we need to drill down, Ed said, just have them in case. If we want to drill down, get some more detail on that, we can.
Okay, I didn't mean to derail this.
No,
It's a good question. And I think part of the issue is, you know, I keep reminding everybody, why was TUD created? We were created to take over a lot of failing systems. And it took a long time to get there, just like the forest overgrowth. It's taken a long time to get there. It's going to take a long time for the professional staff under good leadership to get us out of all of this. And there have been good bites at the apple. But I think what's happening is it's chasing the tiger. There's a ripple effect. Every time we actually improve sections, now there's more pressure on other sections that are going to fail that haven't been improved. And so overtime's from a management point of view is a big dial we're always very concerned about. We track very carefully. And I know that Steve does that and provides Don's shop a monthly report on overtime. So it is an important question and a good question, but I think we're so far behind replacing a lot of these old, aging, failing systems that as we make improvements, we're just chasing those other areas that have still remain to be improved.
And I appreciate you asking, Ron, because, you know, you all know me well enough that I'm just going to go and rip through it. And I look at these numbers every day. And so it's easy for me to assume or something like that, but you have a different perspective. So, Barbara.
Yeah, I would hope that at the end of this, that the board and all of us can have a discussion on what are some of the large scale opportunities to actually put a chunk of dough on something, whether it's a bond, to get a lot of those number one priorities taken care of in one fell swoop. What comes to mind is Bisbee, Arizona. They did that because it's just like our community, but they were able to get a bond to do all their sewer repair. And it was controversial, but they bit the bullet and they did it so that they could have some breathing room and not just reacting all the time. So anyway, I would like us to have a discussion.
We have a slide where we can get into that brainstorming, because at the end of the day, once our job here is try to get everyone educated to the same level of information so that we can have a robust, honest discussion. How are we going to move forward? So,
and you bring up a good point. I mean, from my perspective, I would love to get, you know, the bigger the project, the better and stuff. But unfortunately, it's all this little stuff we worry about. You know, we have these 13 different plants and we have these 14,000 customers who are all over the place. And so we could say, yeah, let's go up to you know, Sierra Pines and build one plant. We'll take care of all this. But in the meantime, we have the day-to-day stuff where, hey, we had a leak last night and we're going here and going there. So I think we have to kind of do a mix of projects. And a lot of these projects, from my perspective, it's not that we didn't have the money to do them. It's just, can we take on a project that big and still service our existing staff as we go along? But I agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to have the discussion, and we will.
And I think, along your lines, Barbara, the county's going, okay, do we need to put a bond in place? There was a whole discussion on, do we look at a parcel tax? Do we look at TUT? Do we look at sales tax? Do we look at some bond? And they're saying, how do we tie it to fire safety and all of that, which is a big buzz term, and it's very, important to look at right now. So I think that ties into some of the discussions we're looking to have with the county, and how can we work together and make some of these things work, and see how we can support each other in looking at it.
Okay. So the next area we're dealing with is what I call non-labor expenses. And, under our old system, our old accounting system, we had about 80 different categories, ranging from fuel to property insurance, to legal fees, to office supplies, to meters. And that's kind of was our starting point. I run a 10-year average as what they've been, look back. I start with Don and Eric and Ed, and we work through that and kind of look at what's going on. Is fuel costs going up? Have our supplies gone up or down? Is there something changing? Then we bring the superintendents in. And so we had a meeting with Don and myself and all the superintendents. And we came out of that meeting kind of saying, Don telling them, you guys need to go see Steve one-on-one. So each of the superintendents, 6 of them, came and saw me individually, and we talked through their non-labor expenses. What do they anticipate? What are the needs? What's changing? What's out there? And so that was our approach to it. Some things are very easy. Like our answering service, there's a scheduled increase in the contract. We have about the same number of calls, may go up or down, but pretty much you can map that out. Other ones are considerably more difficult to do, but we analyze from historical, we analyze what we know, we go into place, and the overall total it was about $5.7 million for fiscal year 20. And in going through theirs, we're looking at outside agencies, TPPA for our electricity usage and that sort of thing. So way back when, one of the board presentations I did was the top 10. I'm no David Letterman, but I like the top 10 effect to it. And Eric Johnson was the same way. Hey, I liked your top 10. Most of these top 10, when I say top 10, we're just looking at non-labor categories that are the highest in terms of total dollar for an annual basis. A couple of them come and go, but for the most part, I'd say 7 to 8 of them are always there each year. So after we did that, and again, this is solely for the fiscal year 21, here was our top 10. And if you just look at those top 10, it's $4 million, and it counts for about 71% of our non-labor operating maintenance. Operating costs have gone up in the budget since the last time we look at compared to last year. In order of total dollars, we have contractual services, we have maintenance supplies.
What goes into contractual services?
Good question. Contractual services can be a very kind of moving target. And a little bit later, we'll be looking at some of the highest dollar items. But for instance, this year we have an interceptor study. It's an outside consultant. That's pretty much what they're going to do. It's $300,000. So included in that 900 is that. We also have a rate study. Was part of the original budget to do within 2020. That was $100,000. We have money for strategic plan in there. Typically, contractual services is normally going to be your consultants, your studies, that sort of thing. But there's also other areas that get hit with that. We may have an outside contractor come in and help us with the water treatment plants and the computer programming. We may have the lake doctor, isn't that what he's called? Lake doctor come in and give us some professional recommendations. We have somebody like Dr. Burt come on board and look for that sort of thing. So it is kind of a broad category, but I have a slide later on where I kind of break it down more on that. But it is high this year, principally because of some of these other big ones that we're going to be talking about after we get in here. Barbara.
Yeah, well, are you done?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Ron, did I cover?
Just on the
Sorry.
interceptor study, that's the sewer, is that the Twain Hart
Yes.
sewer interceptor?
Right,
Okay.
right. Because that's not really a capital project yet. It may turn into, but we gotta kind of, we took it out of CIP at my encouragement, because at this point it's really more of an initial study. It may turn into being a CIP depending what we find and when we do it.
Right. So this is that big thing that we've talked about for years. We're finally gonna stop talking about it, and we're gonna get it done. We're gonna clean it and inspect it and get a real thorough assessment, so we'll know where we stand on that interceptor.
No.
And it's a big expense, well, a third of that.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it we have on a regular basis year after year, some of
A
it's
huge
very
contingent
special.
liability without knowing. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Barbara?
Okay, I'm done now.
Okay, in contractual services, including studies, in the past, and I noticed, this is for, property taxes, there was, 250,000 went to sewer and 770,000 went to, water. I think that was what your slide was. So do you prorate some of this soft money studies, from money to studies? Do you prorate it sort of that way, 2/3, 1/3, or
Yeah.
or does it not matter? It's wherever we need to study.
Yes,
Okay.
it's very specific.
Because this is not a restricted fund per se. Okay.
Well, these are expenses, and you have your water enterprise and sewer enterprise. By law, we have to operate those enterprises so that it's very specific. So if it's a on-call water contract, which is in here, then that goes to the water enterprise. If it's a sewer on-call contract, it goes to the sewer enterprise. So while it's lumped under contractual services, the reality is that specific project's going to go to that enterprise.
Well, I
Very
know
specific.
that. Okay, I'm talking studies. Could you go back to the last slide? So, the green and the blue. So the property taxes, you see, so if we had a study for the sewer, we would pretty much take it out of that 250,000.
Well, or rates,
Let me,
or rates.
Okay.
Because that's what
Yeah, let me-
funds the,
So we don't, I always understood that our property tax was a good pot of money to take studies out of.
let me back up, Barbara, and
Okay.
see if this helps. I
well,
think I know
before
where
you
you're
do, I got
going.
one comment about this. When we talk about water and sewer enterprise, it really is a business enterprise, and revenues really should equal expenses. So that whatever it costs to run the water enterprise, that's what the rate revenues should generate sufficient revenue to pay for the expenses. Now, we do get the benefit of property taxes. That is your board's only general fund money. You have 100% discretion. It's valuable revenue, and there is some threat that the state could take property tax revenues away from special utility districts. They've brought that up over the years. They have not done anything about that to date, but some utilities have tried to plan ahead for that potential and put general fund property tax monies into special accounts that your board could use for, say, special projects or other types of needs that the community has, but that they ensure that any CIP, on-call contracting is all met by rate revenue. Now, other utilities haven't got that far yet, and some of that general fund property tax dollars does go to subsidized rates, because part of the rates is funding your CIP. So you need to take all of this into consideration. I mean, it's your board discretion how much of that property tax dollars you want to use for your CIP and running your enterprise. But theoretically, from a business point of view, we need revenues equal expenses on the water enterprise and on the sewer enterprise. Then you have your property tax dollars to be used for this studies or special projects or other needs of the community.
So I agree with everything Ed said, GM perspective, finance director perspective. I'm going to jump back and maybe give you just a little brief, more 101 governmental, in that I think I see where you're going with this, Barbara. As a general rule, like Ed said, we have water and sewer. That's what we do. So anytime, we have revenue or expenses in there, if it's specifically related to water or sewer, it's going to go there every time. We have a lot of stuff that isn't specifically one or the other. And so we have a formula and a cost allocation plan is how we allocate that. Revenues are a little different. like Ed was getting at there. Essentially, the law says we should charge sufficient service charge revenue to cover our operating expenses, including debt service and capital improvements and reserves. So when the rate study was done in 2015, we adopt a budget. If you're looking at water revenues, and they said, we have $15 million in water revenues, and we have $14 million in water expenses, so I have $1 million extra, okay? Service charge revenues are not discretionary. They are being charged for those operating expenses. Property taxes could be considered discretionary. And in that case, the board could say, those property taxes, I want to go to this, whatever this is. What was done in this rate study, the point I'm trying to make here, what was done in that rate study is the amount of the rate increase put that $777,000 towards service charges. So if right now we said, no, I want that 777 to go to something else, theoretically, we need to have a rate increase equal to $778,000. We designated those property tax dollars to prevent a higher rate increase. Now back to your original question there. Water versus sewer on property taxes is not just a generic allocation. It has to do with where the properties are, because we have some customers that are sewer only. We have some customers that are water only. So we have to go through a big calculation with the state to see how much is going into water and sewer. So then when you fast forward to what's it funding, that $16 million is funding labor, it's funding contractual services, it's funding CIP, it's funding all of those things. So it's not like you're doing that. But your example, your original question, that interceptor would be charged specifically to sewer, and the total revenues have to cover that. It's not just coming out of property taxes. But down the road, if we got to the point and we said, hey, we really want to do something with these property taxes, those are monies you can do certain things with. Does that help?
Yeah, I'll just say this. Yes, it helps. I did not know, okay, this is me. I did not know that the board had shifted those discretionary funds, property tax, which is $1 million. I thought that the designation was for special projects that the board wanted to pursue. Somewhere it had changed over to being part of revenue, and I did not know that. And so that's what I thought. They were still there for projects to study something that we wanted to do for a big, larger bond, or that, the board could move that around. And what I just learned just now is, no, it's part of revenue now. So you answered my question. And I didn't know it shifted over.
Yeah, if that's unknown, when we say shifted, when I got here 10 years ago, it done long before that. Because when I got here, we had a deficit. The total revenue was going there. You couldn't take, if you're running a deficit, you can't say, I'm still going to spend that $1 million on something. I'm just going to make the deficit bigger.
Yeah.
What was being done in 2009 was that all revenues, including property taxes, were going for operations.
Okay.
And we still had that. So there is no conscious shift or board decision or anything since I've been here.
Yeah.
Now this board could turn around and with this budget or next budget or anything else say, I want to carve that out. And
Well,
then
it was
we
a
have to say
policy
how we do it.
decision in that
Yeah.
5-year rate plan.
Right. And that the 5-year rate plan, it was included
It
in the
got
total
codified at that
revenues.
time.
Or it got, okay.
And that got approved 2015.
That's, I just wanted to catch
Sure,
up.
sure.
And Steve touched on the contractual services, including a lot of things like another rate plan. We have to predict with our crystal ball, and like I've said, no crystal ball is perfect. We try to do a good job and estimate or project what the needs are and what the cost is. And you're up for a 5-year update, rate plan update next spring. Whether your board decides to do it is really your board's decision, but we have a placeholder in this line item budget. I mean, you could decide in this budget process, we don't want it. And then next year, when we do it, when we need to do it in the spring, you won't have a budget for it. So you could decide now, or you could decide next spring. But right now, we have a $100,000 estimate for it. There's pros and cons about doing rate planning in-house versus externally. Your last rate plan was done in-house, and they did a good job. And I think you have a good 5-year rate plan. But there is an argument to do it externally, that there is some objectivity by rate-making experts working with your staff to have an independent outside review of your rates and what your rate needs are and develop it.
And we're going to come back to that.
And it does have some credibility if, in a 5-year rate plan. But again, there's pros and cons with each perspective, and there is $100,000 in the contractual services for that. But if we do it in-house, you're not spending $100,000. So when we present these expenses, and Steve and I are in unison on this, we look at this from a worst case scenario. This is what your worst case scenario expenses are going to be for this upcoming fiscal year. We also, on the revenue side, look at worst case scenario. This is the worst case scenario revenues you're going to have. And using that strategy means that when we get to June 30th, 2020, we should not be spending more than the revenues that are coming in using that strategy. And it's a smart strategy, but we do have placeholders in here, and it doesn't mean we necessarily are going to be exercising and spending all of it, but under our prudent crystal ball thinking, these are high priorities that we most likely need to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean your board has to do a rate study and hire a consultant and spend $100,000.
And we're going to circle back and talk about some of these options, choices, possibilities, if you will. Right?
How do you track the, and I realize we haven't had a whole lot of new construction, but how do you track the hookup fees? Where are they?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and I should have probably hit on that.
And we talked about that, and I think, Steve, if I hope I don't get this wrong, we decided not to include those because we do know that there's going to be some new connection fees. But again, connection fees are restricted to capital improvements, to expand capacity. And so you can't just go spend it wherever you want. And we want to be very conservative. There's not going to be huge, massive growth. So I think we chose not to include any of those connection fee revenues in this budget.
Okay.
Historically, and great point, Ron, since I got here, we went through that down cycle and we went from having, however many per year that. We track them internally every time there's a new connection. So we see that. We have a separate revenue account where those are held. The capacity fees are required to be separately held and spent accordingly. So when we go to do the budget, like Ed touched on in there, a good example is grants. We've gotten grants every year since I've been here, and some of them pretty sizable. But to me, unless I have that grant signed, sealed, and delivered, I'm not going to put it in the budget. And almost 99 times out of 100, all of that grant's going to capital improvement. So if I put it here, I'm going to have to add it to CIP. So I tend not to do that. On the same token, being the lifelong CPA that I am, I would much rather be conservative, on the revenues. And if we have a little bit more than that, if interest rates pick up, if some development picks up, a big project comes along like the hospital or something like that, then that gives us a little more breathing room for some of the unanticipated expenses. On the same token, like Ed said, when we do expenses, we want to be pessimistically realistic, if that makes sense. It kind of do the expenses higher than you think they're actually doing, revenues lower than you actually think you're going to do. So the same thing here. We have not included any capacity fees for this. Our growth's been running like 20 to 40 maybe homes a year, and it's just not a big enough number. And most of that capacity fee hookup would be going into the capital. Now, it does affect the revenue as far as service charges. Every new customer it hooks up, we're going to get that base rate from it. But that's the approach we've taken to it.
And it may be higher this year, hopefully, with the economy the way it is and some of the recent approvals. Hopefully, we'll see maybe 100 new connections.
And same thing with property taxes. I tend to limit it to the 1% because that's what the law says in a whole bit. We've seen some big fluctuations with property taxes and where that goes, but I think it at least gets us in the ballpark. And if you looked over, the past 10 years, our budgets have been pretty reasonable. I mean, there's always going to be differences, but they've kind of panned out to being at least the best approach we can. The best knowledge we have right now is what we're presenting to you.
And plus the developer agreements with some of these new developers, another factor is they pay and reimburse some of our staff overhead costs. Yeah. So not only are you getting connection capacity fees and then new customers to expand our economy of scale, but it's offsetting some of our labor costs too. Yeah. So having this good economy is helpful, but we don't budget it in because we're just taking this real practical, careful, conservative approach.
Okay. Other Ron.
So this may have been explained in the past, but I just don't remember if it was or what the actual answer is. Why does TUD get so much smaller amount of property taxes than like CCWD in Calaveras County?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and it's been brought up before, and this is just my observation. I have not been into CCWD's detailed records related to it. But when I first got up here and I started looking at property taxes, the same thing was going on. Murphy's was exploding. You had Ironstone. You had the downtown district. You had that. Angels Camp had just built Greenhorn Creek. Copperopolis had just built Saddle Creek, right? Saddle Creek out there. They built the new shopping center in Copperopolis. Valley Springs built a whole new subdivision of homes. They've got a broad and a distinct different communities than we do. I mean, here we've had, in that same period, we've had the casino, which a little bit before then, but we've had the casino development. We've had the hospital development. But that's what I attribute to them getting, what is it, $3 or $4 or $5 million a year in property taxes versus our million.
I think a part of the answer too, Ron, is that we have more federal non-property tax dollar parcels here than Calaveras does, and I think that's probably the larger reason why we don't get the same property
national
tax
forest
revenues. And I think, I don't know how much you guys know about Prop 13. This was talked about at Legislative Day. Someone asked about it, so Ron, you may recall that answer. And Prop 13 is kind of a sacred measure that no one wants to touch. There's this electronic force field, but everyone knows that there's a lot of inequity in Prop 13, and there's calls for reform to correct some of those inequities. And what we mean by that is that in 1978, when Prop 13 passed, it locked into perpetuity the land use pattern of agencies at that time. So whatever that percentage sharing of property tax revenues were in 1978, that percentage, that's what we have in 2019. So if your county changed a lot in terms of growth and public agency size, it doesn't matter. You're still that formula that the state, our property tax dollars go to the state and then they reallocate it back to local agencies, is based on that 1978 percentage split.
Well, actually, I think Steve finally cleared it up in my mind completely, because I always look at the Calaveras County is smaller than population-wise and everything else. Why in the world are we getting a smaller tax amount than let's say CCWD? But you brought up the point, and now I get it. Is all of these projects that got done over there were for the county? The big projects here all go to the city. Yeah. And so that we don't get any property. There is no.
And it's like Ed said, there are these established ones, but it's kind of what's within our boundaries as well. Like if there's a big development in Groveland, obviously that would potentially affect Groveland Community Services District's property tax. If it's within that Twain Hart, it could potentially affect that. Jeff, you probably know more about this than I'm
You just
saying.
answered my question I was gonna ask, was whether we got a piece of the Groveland pie, but we don't. obviously.
It's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, it's the district's established boundaries.
Well, like Jamestown, the Valley Vista, TUD is going to serve water. So we get half the property tax revenues off that new development. Jamestown Sanitary is going to get the other half.
Yeah, and we haven't had a large lot subdivision going to Tuolumne County in a long time.
Never without trying.
Yeah. but yeah, Calaveras has done some rather large development in the last
Newer building
15
stock,
years.
for sure. Housing stock just seems newer, so the basis is already set there.
Yeah.
I think the point about the 60-40 Fed public or Fed private is huge because us having the 60% in federal used to be advantageous when all the timber sale revenue came back in lieu of those property taxes, because 50% went to roads, and 50% went to schools, and all that went away. And so now that 60-40, and for Calaveras, it's 40-60, 60 in private and 40 in Fed. And so now it's not advantageous to us anymore.
Well, hopefully the feds and the state can get together and figure out how to better manage our forest and create jobs that we all agree to on this Headwaters initiative to generate more revenue so we can go back to where it once was economically in this county.
Be great for a all electeds workshop.
On.
I'm reading these articles about the state water tax, and one day it goes away, and then the next day it comes back. And the latest article I read was 50 cents per hookup per month, which would have on an aggregate would have a pretty good impact of over $100,000 a year to us. Is that something that we just don't budget for until we sort of see that come together, or?
Yeah, so this was a big item over the last couple of days. For those that I think you all know, we spent a couple of days, Director Ron Ringen, myself, and Lisa were in Sacramento with the California Special Districts Association legislative days. I think it was powerful. I'll let them speak for themselves, and we can maybe under manager and director reports talk about it a little bit, but it was very powerful. This was a big topic at the ledge days, but also at Aqua, because a lot of people are looking at this. There's a lot of competing measures. And so it's a moving target, and I think it's non-transparent, to be honest with you. That's what we're hearing from a lot of insiders, is that we just can't predict how this is going to move forward. Governor Newsom has made it clear he wants a water tax and pass that state tax on to local utilities throughout the state. Aqua has a competing bill. I always forget the number. SB 669 that is looking at the state's kind of windfall that they're enjoying right now. I think, what was that number? Is it like $20-30 billion windfall, one-time dollars that the state gets to enjoy? And I think Newsom's being very careful to only spend it on one-time type fixes and needs in the state, not get tied into long-term, because we all know that's not always going to be there. And so Aqua's proposing to use $3 billion, put it in an endowment fund, and let that endowment fund provide safe and healthy drinking water to those poor communities, and let the interest on that endowment fund the future needs. And over time, as we fix these things, there's going to be less and less of a need. But there seems to be an argument that that's too much. And I think there's a compromise bill, and I don't have all the numbers off the top of my head, that seems to be getting some traction where there's still going to be a water tax, just less, and a combination of the water tax and endowment. Now, what shakes out at the end of the day, we don't know, but we're with Aqua and a lot of the other water utilities that they need to keep it off of the back of the local water utilities, because I think the estimate is if we have to endure and be encumbered by collecting a tax on behalf of the state, it's another unfunded mandate. You guys hear that from me all the time. And it's estimated it might cost us as much as $100,000 a year to collect this tax for the state, to send it to the state, and then have to apply for those grant dollars to try to fix some of our lower income systems that are failing. So just not an effective, efficient form of government for providing healthy, safe drinking water for poor communities.
So to
Is
directly,
Is there provisions that allow us to recoup some of those costs to be the debt servicer for the state of California?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
Of course not.
and to directly answer your question, Ron, this budget does not include anything related to that because it's just too up in the air. And that's one of those things as we go along, if something changes, we're going to come back to the board and say, look, we have this has come to our attention. We may or may not need to amend the budget or do that. I'm not a big fan of amending the budget every board meeting or anything else, but if something major were to come up, we might need to. A couple other comments on the items we have up there. Again, I think the maintenance supplies, that's really a direct result in the leaks and breaks. That's the biggest thing it comes through. It's always a big number. As we do some of these, we would expect that to go down over the years. It is dependent upon the cost of materials. Electricity is always a big one for you. For us, I can tell you right now, it's dependent upon weather, hot, cold, everything else on there. But also, we're a member of TPPA, so we get a reduced rate compared to the just straight PG&E. And it's been good to us over the year. They've used some reserves. It's actually gone down in total over the last couple of years. The projection next year is a minimal increase. So it's a big number for us to operate all our facilities, but it could be a whole lot worse. Meter supplies, and it may be in the near future, right? Meter supplies is one of the areas that is dependent upon. We have a new department for distribution. We have a new superintendent. Our superintendent has some, I think, really strong plans and objectives, what he wants to accomplish. We're trying to support that as much as we can, but, meters are expensive. But the goal here is, while we have our day-to-day meters failing, we have to replace them. We're also looking to continue to upgrade to auto-read meters wherever we can.
Well, this is an area, too, that's mandated.
Yeah.
State mandates a certain percentage of the meters be replaced every year.
And so that's built into that number, and it's higher than we've had. The repairs and maintenance, that's our ongoing deferred stuff that Don frequently brings up. Chemicals, that we treat water, and that's it. There isn't any big change in the chemical costs this year, but it is one of our top 5 usually every year. Legal fees, they've kind of gone up and down, as you've seen. We got a lot of things. A lot of oars in the water right now with a variety of things. So that includes that. Patch paving, the board just adopted at the last board meeting, I believe it was. Regulatory compliance, those are all the state fees, permits, the ones that we have every year in there. They tend to change from year to year, so that's our best estimate. And lastly, property and liability insurance. It's critical to what we do and how we operate. And I think we just got one property insurance, 11%, Abby?
11%.
Yeah. So how do you plan on that? I don't know. If we told our customers we were doing 11% increase, this room would probably be full. I don't know. But, they've been good to us over the years. Abby does a real good job in keeping the claims low and getting every credit we can, our experience factor. But I don't think we planned on 11%. I think we had 6% last time around there. Everything below here is, there's a few of them that are over 100 and less than 200. Maybe 5 more would fit in that category. But then you go down there and you break it down to, there are all these individual ones that are less than $100,000. All right, Ron.
Just one quick question.
Sure.
On the insurance. Was that 11% increase possibly partially because of the new addition for, I heard about this at Auckland. I'm trying to remember, put it in the right words, but they're now offering insurance in case there's a fire that takes out, like the Paradise Water District. I don't know what they're called, but they're now trying to
that inverse condemnation issue.
Yeah,
that's what PG&E's facing in the water districts. And I think I told the board I was going to send out a letter where there's bills being sponsored in Sacramento to deal with the inverse condemnation to utilities, whereby in the past, I think the example was what Yorba Linda County Water District in 2012. I forget what that fire was called. Yorba Linda County Water District wasn't responsible for the fire. They were damaged just like everybody else was, and as a result of the damage, they couldn't provide water supply to their ratepayers and were sued, and were responsible for paying a $70 million lawsuit. But in their case, they were insured under Aqua JPIA and were covered through their excess carrier coverage, or that would have bankrupted the utility. Based on that knowledge, I've brought this to the attention of Abby, and we've checked with our carrier, SDRMA, which is, I suppose we could say, a competitor to Aqua JPIA. And in the past, your staff has done comparisons between the two. It looks like SDRMA is more cost effective for us. But they're both very good, and we are checking with SDRMA to make sure we're covered. I think there's a little gray in their response that we probably need to be careful and make sure it's black and white, because we are in a fire-prone area, and we don't want to risk a $70 million judgment against TUD and not be covered by the excess insurance carrier. Because if that's the case, you might as well just lock the doors and walk away, because there's not enough money to pay that kind of settlement.
And as I recall, Ron, the 11% didn't specifically identify that. It may be affected by that, but it's not like we've put on a new adder or a new.
Okay.
The 11% increase was directly on the rates, and if you'll recall, Dennis Timoney, the Chief Risk Officer from SDRMA, was here in February, and he indicated, he let you guys know, talked about being in a pool, that TUD's in a pool with hundreds of other agencies like ourselves, special districts like ourselves, and that fires like the one in Paradise, those are some of the reasons that the increase.
I think it's hitting everyone in the Sierra.
Yeah. Now, of course, anytime we acquire infrastructure or have new facility or anything, then we have more to insure as well. So those are some of the increases, but yes, across the board, SDRMA's rate's been up 11%.
All right, we'll continue on with kind of the overview here. My next slide is really dealing with the capital improvement budget, which we had a separate meeting on that. But as with the district's fiscal year 17, 18, 19 budgets, significant investment in new infrastructure remains a central theme to bring customers a greater level of long-term reliability in their public water and sewer systems. The district's rate study emphasized infrastructure needs, and multi-year rate increases were included as capital goals of the district. Ed kind of alluded to it in his opening remarks, but here's where I made a bullet, Ed, for you as to, while we have our CIP budget and this one in here, we really still have these millions out there of our deferred infrastructure. Anything more on that, or you good?
Well, I just want to emphasize, there's no way we can do it all. There is just absolutely no way. I mean, that's been the story of Tuolumne County for a half a century plus. I mean, there's a lot of needs out there and not enough money. But I think what you have before you and what staff's presenting is a prudent bite at the apple to try to get us little by little toward a modern, well-run, well-maintained system. But it's going to be a long road there. This isn't going to happen in 1 year or 2 years or even 5 years. It's going to be 10, 15 years. Some of us may not even be around when some of this stuff gets done, but we're taking that step in the right direction. And that's why we're having this discussion, because at the end of the day, we need you educated so that you can have an intelligent discussion about how do we prioritize and what are the highest priorities, because we can't do it all, and some things are going to just have to fall off the table. And that's kind of the sad message here. We'd like to do it all. I know Don's really about doing it all, but at the end of the day, I don't know. We're going to present what we can, and then your board's going to have to decide how do you want to turn some of these large knobs, and we got a slide on what those large knobs are.
I just want to say that subsequent boards have been here before always with the deferred maintenance as priming the board for another rate increase. And I just want to say I don't think we're at this turtle pace, and where we go back to the populace is really the model. I would really like us to shift to getting something, a different model, explore a different model than this one, which is we can't keep up with it. And so we're going to have to go back to the ratepayer, and then we'll try. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to try to get it. How?
So that's a good question
Mm-hmm.
or comment. And what you're going to see in the slides ahead is staff's not recommending going back to the ratepayer and pay for everything, because we understand and are sensitive to the board's concern regarding rates, and we also are practical that we don't have a ratepayer base to be able to do everything. And so what you'll see is a part of the budget that Steve will present as part of your top 10 is some outside of the box thinking about how are we going to leverage the rate dollars we do have to maybe pull in 3, 4, 5, 10 times the amount of money that we're collecting from the ratepayer. So, for instance, if we take $1 from the ratepayer, can we find $10 and state, federal, private dollars to instead of doing $1 improvement, let's do $11 of improvement. And so we have line items in here for grants, public relations, lobbying. But I mean, it's like a poker game. Steve and I have been going back on this. If you want to enter the poker game, it's going to cost some money on the table to be at the table to play. And there's no guarantee we're going to win this, but we got to be at that table if we think we're going to get some of these big dollars. For instance, like the regional water treatment plant consolidation. I'd love to see those done in the next 3 years, both of them, the one at Sierra Pines and Sonora, and along with some of these water storage tanks. So when Ron talks about, overtime and some of these problems we have, if we had just those alone with some of the piping done, I'm sure we'd have a much more effective, reliable system that would reduce OT. There's no way we have the money. We're looking at just those two alone. We're looking probably almost $100 million between the two regional water storage tanks, consolidating the regional treatment plants, consolidating water storage tanks, and some of the distribution. We have to find big dollars. And that's where we're looking at lobbying, legislation, and that's why we're ramping up legislative efforts, outreach. That's why we're doing the tour, partnering. I think it's going to be a little bit of all of the above to really go after the big dollars, to try to do what you're saying, Director Balin. Let's not rely on the ratepayers. Let's look at all these other sources of funding.
Yes, I agree. And even, I'd put a Kickstarter on there for some generators. Just focusing on one thing, get off our plate, because it just makes everybody feel like they accomplished something. Mm-hmm. But I appreciate you saying that, because I would say for every single dollar, every dollar must be leveraged, and multiple benefits. Mm-hmm. That's our creed. There it is. And otherwise, I just feel like we're not, getting ahead of anything at this pace.
But we're talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about is complicated.
Yeah.
And takes a lot of work. But we are talking about it. It's in our strategic plan, and we're doing it. But again, the devil's in the details. So it is a part of this budget. And now we got to put it into practice once this budget's adopted over the upcoming year, and that's going to be the hard part.
And excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What Director Koff said is starting to really look at consolidating some of our brain power with the brain power at the county and the city, and delegate somebody to do some temporary oversight so a project actually gets completed, because a lot of these messy, unwieldy, joint agency things, there's really nobody in control, and so by rotating some of that and sharing that and pooling our brain power, I think is another way we're going to get ahead, because the multiple benefits will begin to start chipping away in a passive way at some of the other problems that by the time we get a grant, some of those things will already have been accomplished to a level where then we can come in and really clobber it in a successful way. So anyway, I think we're all, in violent
Yeah.
agreement here.
Bob?
Are we gonna, am I understanding right, are we gonna start doing RFPs for grant writing proposals? And
Yeah, so,
now that we can do all this stuff in-house.
I think we have added some discretionary budget. We want to be careful because we're sensitive. When we add any kind of a line item, we're just increasing our expenses. So we're trying to be sensitive to that. But I think that we have a line item that allows us to do some of what you're talking about. I know Director Balin's been interested, and we haven't hired a grant writer yet. But we have exercised cooperations with consulting firms that are willing to write grants without charge on behalf of TUD if they can participate in the implementation of that project and derive some revenue stream to kind of make it worth their while to help us write grants. But, the thing with hiring an outside grant writer is that unless they're really intimately familiar with TUD, Tuolumne County, and where we're heading, it takes a lot of time for staff to interact with that consultant, to educate them, to get them up to speed, to be able to write a product. Because at the end of the day, grants are very, like I've mentioned before, you've heard this from me, they're super competitive. They have to be well written. They have to tell a story in a very high level way. We have to put a face on behalf of the district. The other thing is you really need a project that's marketable, that meets the priorities of what the state and the feds are looking for. So not every project we have is real marketable. So it has to be marketable and meet those priorities. We have to have frequently a shovel-ready project. They're not going to fund a project that's just a concept. We have to, put some financing in to get us beyond concept to a shovel ready, which means you've got, at least 30 to 60, maybe 90% design done. You've got to have CEQA and NEPA done. That's when we're talking about shovel ready. And then lastly, we really need to show the partnerships, where you have letters of support or cooperation between county, city, special district, NGOs, environmental groups. When we can check all those boxes, then we become very competitive in the grant world, and we can exercise some discretion on grant writers. I know that I do get requests from directors from various areas that are interested in, hey, here's a grant opportunity. What about that? And what about this opportunity? And this gets back to our district engineer's grant presentation. And this is chewing into the weeds, but I think it's healthy for us to hang here for a moment and talk this out a bit. Do we go after grants just because there's a grant opportunity and we chase them, knowing that whatever project that might fit within that grant is not necessarily a key priority of TUD, which is a policy decision defined by this board? Or we identify the key project priorities we have and then go in search of grants that are going to fund those priorities. Those are the two bookends. And I would suggest in the 6 months I've been here, we're not real crystal clear on how all this works yet. This is still a dynamic, evolving process. I want to try to help elected officials out when you guys come up with ideas about this grant and that grant. And I've been doing that, but I don't have clear policy direction on this topic. And so I think that we don't necessarily need to answer it today at this moment. I'm just bringing this up because this is an important topic that moving forward for staff, it would help if we get great clarity about what your board wants to do in trying to find some of these grants. Are we going to only focus on, say, our top CIP projects, or are we going to include some of these other grant opportunities that are out there? And what do they look like? And how do we go about it?
I think part of the problem is that we as a board haven't really sat and looked at the amazing amount of money that's in Prop 68 and discussed all the categories and the possible ways it could benefit and leverage TUD money that we really haven't thought collectively in a workshop to go, oh, here's some money for restoration of man-made conveyance. Okay, here's money for that. You don't have to do your NEPA. You don't. This is acquisition dollars to buy property. You know, things like that. We as a board haven't sat down and really looked at potential. Here's the money, and what might be a direction. I'm just afraid that if we just stick to the this other little narrow category, we're not going to be broadening and then looking at it, an outsider who knows all the compliance stuff. I mean, I think maybe not knowing our system is the tiniest part. They know everything else. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I'm at is I don't know if you know the ins and outs of Prop 68 money, but there's 17 categories. The only one we don't qualify for are the ocean, where the ocean people live. Everything else, we could benefit. Because we're the mountain clan, you know. I saw you chuckle there. The ocean people and the mountain people. But I really do believe we could just kill a bunch of birds with one stone, because inherent in all that is for water efficiencies. By helping with the environment, when we get our efficiencies out of it, it's a good fit. And that's where I just would like the board to really explore that grant and so that we can develop some policy.
So, as much as you're not clear as to what direction go in, I've had this discussion with Dawn on several occasions. I think this board's not clear as to what direction we should be going in the fact that as much as I am familiar with the TUD system and everything, I don't know what the absolute top priorities are, and I think it would be very important to hear from staff, especially the GM and the operations manager, what those are. If we knew which ones and how they fit on the list, well, then we as a board collectively can not only have an understanding of what's most important and what we need to get after first, but then we all as individuals could get out and start beating the weeds trying to find that money too.
I think that that's a good point, Ron. And I think for staff, really our core mission's water and sewer. And so when we did the CIP and you look, say, the top 10 of the CIP, that's staff's priorities. And I'm glad Barbara brought up Prop 68 and she's interested in some of these other opportunities that I think are good for the region. And I'm supportive of that. My question as the general manager and trying to support Barbara in these kind of more broad regional values and benefits about being a destination community and improving quality of life is how does that fit with the top 10 CIP priorities? And how do we dovetail those together in a way that's meaningful, that stretches our dollars? It may be great for the region, but is that a TUD specific priority, for instance, so we can try to paint a face that's maybe a little more clear? Barbara has brought up Prop 68 to me a couple of times, and I think it's a good opportunity, but I haven't scratched my head. What does a good project look like? You know, because again, if all we're talking about is real high level concept, it's hard for me to bring it down into the detail that I have to write about to be able to be successful in a super competitive grant environment. So a good recent example, a Prop 68 that's coming up, it's in the public comment phase right now, is recreational trails on the ditches. That allows for funding for acquisition. We know those ditches are all on private lands. And I'm not saying we can necessarily do this, but I'm trying to figure out a way where we can that's not going to cost TUD too much money. So to that end, I went and met, or I had Tuolumne County Transportation Commission come to my office, Tyler Somerset, and then I had Michaela here, who's worked in the past on some of these issues. And we talked about, would TCTC take the lead on a Prop 68 grant project and be interested in writing that grant for recreational trails on ditches? And can you, TCTC, identify a pilot demonstration project that you think would be competitive? And the result of that meeting was that they have an example. They're excited about it. And then when I drilled down in the detail about, okay, so TCTC will take the lead on the grant. They'll write it. It's on TUD land. Well, who's going to, there's always a local cost share component to most grants. Who's paying the local cost share? Well, TCTC said, probably not TCTC. So now it comes back to, well, is that a high enough priority for TUD to pay the local cost share, whatever that is? We're going to be talking to the county recreation department, because now if we do something like this and we put a permanent bathroom in, which is subject to vandalism and all kinds of weird stuff, I don't know why bathrooms attract all that, but is the county willing to pay the O&M on that? And so there's a lot of these details that get fleshed out, and we're not there yet, but we're trying to do what we can to look at some of these other grant funding opportunities to help with the quality of life in the county without enmeshing TUD as, say, the lead on something that's good for the region that's not necessarily our highest priority. But perhaps one of the best ways to answer Barbara about this board hasn't had a robust discussion about some of these other valuable benefits to the region that Barbara's bringing up. Maybe we have a workshop, and when some of these grants opportunities come up and your board talks it out, because right now I'm getting out there on a limb trying to do what I can without crystal clear board direction on policy about what do you want us to proceed with.
Just for the record, Prop 68 doesn't come out of my mouth without stressing there has to be a component of efficiency. Okay, it's not just about, oh boy, we're going to get people to live here because now we have trails. I just want everybody to know that it has to point back to, because any project I have worked on we've been able to embed money for improvements or, upgrade a certain problem or fix a leak. I just want everybody to know that it has an avoidance and it has something in it for TUD. Anyway,
that's the multi-benefits you're talking about.
Yeah.
You're going to multi-benefits principle, and I agree with that to the degree we can capture grant dollars for all kinds of other benefits. But remember, I got Don looking at me right now. I feel the pressure, Don. 70 million in deferred CIP, and I mentioned the other 100 million that we could spend on regional water treatment plant consolidation and water storage tanks. So staff is feeling the pressure of a failing system on just core infrastructure replacement that makes it difficult for staff to think creatively about some of these other multi-benefit types of grant programs out there that do require us a lot of time and effort, if not money, time and effort to reach out to the county, to TCTC, to other project partners to be able to pursue those grants, to talk about local cost share, O&M, and so forth. So it is a complicated area, and I think that these kinds of discussions help provide greater clarity for us. But right now, I've taken it on under my authority to work with TCTC to look at a demonstration project. I'm not sure engineering's real supportive of me because that Sierra Pines recreational trail loop along the ditch is going to necessarily go right by our new regional water treatment plant.
So why can't we get a grant presentation from a couple of real professional grant writers for our board to see what they can do that we can't do?
Well, I take a little bit of exception, real professional grant writers, because I would put myself up there, the cream of grant writing anywhere in the state. So
But do you have the time?
And we do have staff. I'm looking at Lisa and I'm looking at Michaela. They're busy people, but your staff already has secured $30 million in grants over the last 10 years. And I think we can possibly leverage additional grant writing support. And that's why we do have a line item to be able to hire a outside grant writer. But I think we have to be real careful here, and we got to be balanced and prudent, because it is going to take some time for staff to be able to get the information they need to be able to write the grant. For instance, the most recent was EN2, a consulting firm we work with that your board approved at your last board meeting on those new magnetic water meters in the ditch. While EN2 took the lead in writing that grant application, which was very nice, they didn't even charge us for it. Michaela, from what I understand, had to spend a lot of time organizing information, getting that information to EN2 to be able to put that grant application together. So just because we can go out and hire a grant writer, that doesn't mean that they can go into the ether and then write a grant application on behalf of TUD. The reality is, even if we hire a grant writer, I'm just speculating right now based on my education and experience with grant writing, we're still going to spend 60% consultant, 40% staff to be able to write that grant application. Maybe it's 50-50, maybe it's 80-20. I don't know the exact split, but it does take a lot of staff time. Every time we hire a consultant, just like the on-call construction contracting for design engineering, our staff's still probably spending 30-40% of their time educating that design engineer on how to get to 100% design. Because we give them the scope of work, we give them the parameters, we give them our standards and specs. They go off into their own office and they design in AutoCAD. Then we get 30% design. Then we got to spend a couple of weeks reviewing that 30% design and probably making about 100 revisions to it. And then those go back. Then we get 60%, then 90 and 100. And it's an iterative process, but grants are the same way. There's going to be a lot of requirement for staff to be able to review what these consultants are doing on the outside, and we only have so much time, which gets back to our priorities. What are our core priorities, and are we keeping our eye on the ball? Because if we get too distracted, we're not going to be successful at some of those core priorities. And I keep going back to water supply reliability and acquisition of our water system. And then I got Don's heated stare about this failing infrastructure, which I completely agree with him. I'm glad he's got that constant pressure reminding us, don't forget about these failing systems. And so somehow, and this gets back to this discussion at hand, what grants are we going after? And how are we going to get these multiple benefits addressed? And I know Ron's interested in fire water draft points. Everyone agrees with it. The question is, who's designing it? Where are they going strategically? Who owns the property? Is there ingress, egress? Is there a staging area? Who's going to be owner operator and maintaining all of that? None of that's been discussed yet. It's got to be part of a regional discussion, and there's probably not dollars for it. So that means we're going to be going after, say, OES, pre-disaster mitigation dollars, or some other grant source. And I can guarantee you it's got to be a collaborative effort, because that's what these grant making agencies do. They look at letters of support and the partnerships. Those are the ones that score high. So I'm just using a couple of quick examples: the recreational trails on ditches, the fire water draft points I would rather call regulation reservoirs, so we can get multiple benefits in terms of making the ditches more efficient and provide an opportunity if they're strategically located for what Ron would like to do. But again, we've got to have a smart plan and path forward. What do you want staff applying for? And if we hire an outside grant writer, is it going to be a project that is checking all of these boxes, a priority? multiple benefits, because I don't want to be spending money on these consultants because it's going to take staff time, and I want to be successful. I want 100% success rate at grants.
Go ahead.
We got.
So that's where I think that we need to come to an understanding and agreement that it's not just staff's obligation and job to do all that. I consider it my job as a director to try and make some of this sort of things at least start bringing the right people together, have the right conversation, and so on, in order to make those sort of things begin to come together. Where I've got two things I want to bring up. One is that, you know, three of my board members apparently have some sort of problem with a letter that I wrote recently. And, you know, all I did is get very pointed as to what was going on. We're not getting any cooperation from the county, and it's not because of that letter. We have had one meeting put together by Barbara Balin in 2012 between the Board of Supervisors and this board here. It's always been totally separate. We need partners. We're willing to partner with them, but I don't see them willing to partner with us. So that's number one. We need to get everybody together and start working together. The other thing I want to bring up, if I can find the darn thing.
While you're looking for that, I do have a meeting with Tracy Riggs tomorrow, and we are talking about creating a joint board meeting. And so we are pursuing that partnership, and I think that the county is very open to that as well.
So then, like I said, I consider it my obligation. I mean, Firewater Draft Points is not about Ron Ringen. Ron Ringen's not going to get a damn thing out of that. This is Ron Ringen pushing for the county to protect itself. I had a very good discussion with a fellow that I cannot pronounce his last name, but he's the director of OES. He is extremely interested in Firewater Draft Points, and he's going to get back to me, and he thinks that he has a way to get some money, grant money, to get that done. That is the director's job, in my opinion.
It is definitely helpful. I would agree that is part of the lobbying platform that we have a line item for in this current budget. And I think if your board includes that line item and adopts the budget, then you have to identify your top 10, I love top 10 lists too, your top 10 legislative platform in lobbying. What do you want to lobby for? And that could be one, although you know me, I want to call them regulation reservoirs instead of firewater draft points, because I think there's more needs than just strictly a firewater draft point for a fire apparatus. I want to try to make the ditches more efficient, and like Barbara stated, we need more storage downstream of Phoenix. So I want to see those multiple benefits, and and I agree, and I think with that OES director, I was in another workshop, but what I've heard and I've seen a follow-up email, they're pulling together their upcoming fiscal year budget. They want to deal with this PSPS, but if they can put money in a line item for TUD on, these regulation reservoirs, maybe for OES they want to call it a firewater draft point. I'm fine with that, whatever they want to call it. If they're willing to put a line item in there, let's do it. But again, it gets back to, I'm sorry, just 1 minute. I have yet to have anyone answer the question, because all these ditches are on private property, which makes it very difficult for staff to operate, maintain, and access. Where are these firewater draft points or regulation reservoirs going to go? We have not studied where those strategic locations are, because at the end of the day, they're very expensive. And Twain Harte CSD is a unique situation that is not directly applicable to TUD. I think in our discussion, we're in the vicinity of $70,000 to $100,000 per firewater draft point. Okay, that's a simple line item reality. You got to buy land, you got to create ingress, egress, you got to have staging, you got to have CEQA, NEPA done possibly, and when you add it all up, they're not going to be cheap. So if we're going to do this, and I think everyone's in agreement, where's the best strategy or strategic location for these? And then at the end of the day, We don't have an answer for that yet. My thinking is in GIS, you look at where all those ditches cross major roads and arterials. And that's probably, from that criteria, the best place, because that's where they're most easily accessible. And then secondly, I want to hear from Cal Poly, and we're starting to get some results back now from a ditch point of view. Where's some key storage locations? We've already heard back something interesting I haven't even thought about. I don't know, did you think about? So Dr. Charles Bird is saying use our existing water storage tanks as that regulation reservoir to help meet peak demands on the ditch. I hadn't thought about that. It was kind of out of the box, unique, creative thinking, but using that as an example, if we were to do that on the ditch for making the ditches more efficient and the other criteria, fire, water, drought points, where would they go? And I think GIS is the best way to try to answer that. And then who's going to own it? Who's going to operate and maintain it? That's what I want to know.
I think, yeah, I wanted to get back to what the point Bob brought out, because I kind of think that a lot of this is just a chicken and the egg discussion, which is valuable. And, you know, we can always say, you know, we've got the pressure of just getting our core mission done. We will always have that. That's just baseline pressure we all wake up and put on in the morning. But I think Bob made a good point, is unless we have somebody who's, you know, I'm thinking of a Bob Reeb type grant writer that can come in and talk to the board so that we, I mean, I understand that it takes staff time. We understand that. We can always say, well, the staff doesn't have enough time. So basically, where you're redirecting us, and rightfully so, is business as usual. But if we don't break out of that and have a whole other discussion on grants and where we could be going and how we could be leveraging the board, how are we going to get educated on doing stuff differently that will actually get back to what Don wants? It's kind of like, oh, we're off on this tangent. It's not really, you know, germane, and I, quite frankly, actually really want to have a discussion on what is available by folks that are out there in the real world and going, well, this is where the money is, and this is how your system can fit that, and this is how we can facilitate that so that your staff doesn't. And maybe we have to shift some of our staff towards a new direction of just doing nothing but leveraging, you know, the Department of Leveraging. So that, you know, Eric can do his job. But, you know, there's real resistance in how we're defining ourselves and our mission. And I feel like the board, and I feel like it's not coming from you, Steve, or it's not coming from you. It's coming from a good place and a good heart, which is we got to do a job here. And what we don't want is to have the board over here seeking grants and we're falling apart. I really honor that, okay? So when I say resistance, I'm saying I feel resistance because the board wants to go in certain directions. For an example, I'm not worried about the cart before the horse, how to build a cistern and where it goes. What I want is for us to go, do you realize that we have to have our potable water for post-fire recovery? And that is gold. That potable water is our goal. So let's direct everybody else, because I can guarantee you when CAL FIRE put out that fire up on Big Hill, they didn't run around for a hydrant because the Columbia ditch was there. And they didn't run around looking for a fire water draft point. They pulled up next to it and they drafted and they put out the fire. It is not a big deal. It is just, wherever can we just drive up? Because am I like off here? Because they didn't run around with their hair on fire going, oh, we don't have a fire water draft point right here. So my point is, we have to direct any contractor, any out of place, out of county person to use our non-potable water. So we are not in this position. That was the whole point of my PowerPoint. You know, and I gave examples to try to build it in people's heads. I wasn't saying, well, it's got to be built like this. I'm not putting you down, Director Ringen. I'm just saying, let's say everybody use non-potable first. so we can save our assets for
Well,
rebuilding.
and-
That's all I'm saying. And then let's get professional grant people out here. We can worry about the design. Let CAL FIRE worry about the design. But when you know what hits the fan, they're gonna find any water anywhere.
And Josh White has said that he's intelligent, the fire people are intelligent, they know where the water is, but I still want to have a nice GIS layer showing everything in all of our critical facilities.
If we do not, as a board, nail this water down and actually dedicate it as a bona fide use for our community, the state will take it. It's such a big duh in my mind. It is what keeps me up at night, because if we do not do that, what is all this? Water for our community, water security. There's nothing more important than dedicating non-potable for fire, so that it's a use, so that our system doesn't dry up, because as we become a donor county for other people that want to use it for their fire and municipality and trails, we have it here. And our board, we have created a policy that says you will use non-potable water first. And by the way, here's where all our assets are, and this is what we want protected. In any way, shape, or form. This is the priority, so that we don't have to get faced with a lawsuit or worse, run out of potable water for our hospitals and everything else. That was my point, not where they are. And I just wanted to clarify that. And again, Ron, I'm not putting down all your hard work. I just want to say I think we need to do a policy on using non-potable water first before we drain. Because we saw this at Aqua. How many minutes did it take before Santa Rosa's potable treated water was drained to put out the fire?
Well, they had plastic pipe melting in the ground, which will happen
Then they
here
had
as well.
benzene.
But I do two quick answers for you. Is one, we're working on a GIS system of everything water related, and then identify. I want color coding on critical infrastructure. If we got to save this and let that go, I want Don to have the expertise to weigh in, so we can give outside fire contractors those types of intelligent maps, so they know all this stuff, and they're going to go wherever the closest water is. And I don't think they're going to use hydrants unless it's a structure fire. They're going to go to raw water sources. The tenders, they may use. I think they're just going to use whatever they can at the time. And on the grants, staff is not resistant. We actually have line items, multiple line items, to be creative, to do what you're talking about. And
I didn't say staff was.
There's not a
I
resistance.
Because I don't ever want to be there, but I hear it from you, Ed.
I have no resistance. No, we're not resistant. You're misunderstanding me if you're seen as resistant, because we have multiple line items to do what you want to do. In fact, I've already talked to TCTC. We're talking to CAL FIRE, and when we're talking to OES, I'm looking forward to that. So no one's resistant here, but I'm looking at Don and trying to meet Don's needs. And what I've suggested is that there is a gray area when it comes to some of these other grants that are taken away from the 10-year or the top 10 of the CIP. And then we're still got to get back to, and I hesitate, we're way off the budget, but I think this is a healthy discussion. And that is, if there's a grant, do we come up with a project to try to go after it? Or do we identify the project and then go find the grant to fund it? And those are the two bookends. And what I said earlier in these opening remarks is that there's not good clarity from the board about how you want to bridge those two bookends. Because we do get requests, staff gets requests from various directors about, here's a grant, here's another grant, and let's do something. And I'm in support of everything that's been shared here today, but I'm still leaving you with this message that staff doesn't have 100% clarity on how you want to proceed with this. And we don't necessarily need to answer it today, because this is a budget workshop, but I think that maybe this needs to be agendized again. But if you can provide, if your board can provide clarity, you can here today, but how are we going to proceed with some of these grant projects and still meet the needs of the CIP?
Ron?
Yeah, I mean, I think the board does need to give you guys clarity on, what is our top 10 or whatever term you want to do. And then to the extent that there is another grant opportunity that comes up, it should come back to the board. And as Jeff said, we would look for staff to tell us what is that net effect. And is that net effect going to be with using existing staff, or is there a way that we can go use outside consultants so it reduces some of that net effect? But I think it needs to go back to what are the core issues, and then how do we look at these other grant opportunities related to those core issues. So I think where we've talked about a workshop or some of these other things, I think based on where we're going with the CIP, I think it would be good to say, and I think it's some of these, it's going to be, this is our core issue with this water treatment plant, go after those grants. This is where we are with that sewage treatment plant, go after those grants, and the others may fall somewhere in the middle between those bookends. But I think it's our role to have, you give us the input, we pick the direction, but then at the same time, it doesn't preclude adding some of these other issues in there, but just what is the real net effect, and how do you mitigate it as much as possible if that's something we decide we want to go after.
Go ahead, Ron.
So, I disagree with you, Director Kopf, as far as the board should be identifying the top 10. I want to hear it from that guy right there.
I want to hear it from them, and then we, based on their input, we select the top 10 so that they're not getting whipsawed with those other pieces. And then if another piece comes up, it doesn't get added in until it's brought back to the board with the net effect, and we make the decision on how we're going to go do it or not.
That's what I said earlier, is that I wanted to have that knowledge as to what those overarching issues are that we need to be working on. Because then when we're out doing what we're supposed to be doing as board directors, we can maybe kick the right rock and find the right grant funding or whatever.
So I'm real sensitive to time, and I think Steve's looking at his presentation. We've kind of drilled down to a lot of detail away from the budget, so we probably need to get back. And I see lunch here, and I don't want to hold that up too much, so I'm not.
I can go through a couple more slides.
Let's do that
now. Honestly, I'm kind of confused at this point, and I'm at the operating budget. So I'm hearing different things from everybody.
If I may, let me bring this back, because I can tell this isn't going to be solved right here today, right now. But I want to be clear that staff's supportive of looking at all of these. But when staff gets grant requests from various directors on this, that, and the other, that's not necessarily in the top 10 CIP, then we're not sure what the priority is. So I think what I'm hearing from the board is maybe we hold another workshop after your budget's adopted, and assuming we got a line item for lobbying and we have line items in here for grant writers, that maybe we invite some folks in, hold a workshop. What are your priorities legislatively in terms of lobbying and these multi-beneficial projects? And then have a focus session for that type of discussion at that workshop, because I don't think we're going to get there today, and we still got a budget presentation to get through and a $4 million deficit. So I'd recommend, unless there's a last minute comment related to this, we go through a couple more slides, take a break for lunch, and then come back. And maybe, I know we like this interaction, but it might be best to get through the presentation and then open it up to Q&A and problem solving on the deficit.
I just want to comment on my earlier comment about net effect. We got a $70 million deferred maintenance issue, correct?
Plus.
And it's not going to get any smaller until we get after it here. We're $4 million already in the hole before we even start this year. That's what I mean by the net effect. I hope that we would not ask our staff to spend valuable time to come up with stuff that's going to add to our workloads. We need to be working on this kind of stuff. Just my opinion.
Why don't you jump back? So you're not confused, Steve. You know exactly what you're doing.
Okay. Operating budget. All right. And the one comment I'm going to have on this before I leave this slide is, Barbara, I'm sorry if your takeaway is that I was inferring we needed a rate increase. Absolutely not even that. What I was trying to communicate with this slide is that when the rate study was adopted in 2015, an integral part of it was significant capital improvement. Over the past 4 years, we have done significant capital improvement. We have taken those rate increases, we've implemented it, it's gone into the ground, and this is the last year. We have another scheduled increase. So capital improvement is an integral part of that. That's all I was trying to say there. Ed asked for me to add the next couple slides, top 10. Again, those big top 10. Now, what's important here, this is the top 10 CIP for fiscal year 20 for water. Now, what's important here is these are sorted by total dollar amount, and these are not total project cost. These are what we feel we are going to do during the next fiscal year. So many of these may be phase one. So again, don't look at it and say, oh, this one here is only this much dollars. It's, again, what we're talking about accomplishing during the next fiscal year. So, if there's any, these came up, they're part of the CIP that was presented to you before, but these are the top 10 water. And then we have
Hold on, go back to water before you leave that slide. For instance, what Steve's saying is in the CIP, it identified Willow Springs as a high priority project, but it's $5 million. And I was caught off guard. I was like, geez, Don, you're wiping out the water CIP in one swoop with this $5+ million distribution system replacement project. It's a critical project because that's responsible percentage-wise. I don't have it off the top of my head for one of the larger percentages of the call-outs and overtime. And so we want to correct it. But I said, boy, Don, you're wiping out the water CIP. And he said, no, we're going to do Willow Springs and phase it over 5 years. So that Willow Springs $525,000 cost is just your first phase of a longer 5-year phase. And
one thing that might help is maybe put in one other column and just say balance remaining or something. So when we're looking at that, it lets us know.
Well, it's already in the CIP, but yeah, we could have added it here. The main was we were focusing on just this year's CIP. And so
well, I know what the total cost is, but just like what's the remaining cost, so that you have some way of projecting forward. When you're just looking at this budget.
And
Today, these are just overview slides. I didn't have anything in there for CIP. Ed wanted the top 10. When we get to June 11th, or as you've seen before, we could have the full thing over the next 5 years showing the total project cost. But this, again, you'll see as we get past this, we're going to circle back and talk about this some more. But that's what this represents.
And I was looking at total remaining project cost because I don't want just the total cost, and then that gives you none.
Right.
But, yeah.
So of this, that's about, I think the proposed water CIP is a little over 5, but the top 10 represent most of that cost. And then the other takeaway here is that we're hoping to get significant grant dollars so that we're not, of this 4.5, if the state can get its act in order, for instance, Cuesta Heights, what would you suggest, 50-50 in a grant?
We have both applications in. We have an application for a grant, which is for $3 million.
That's for the larger project.
And yeah, for the overall project. And then we also have an application for the same amount in the form of a low interest loan. There would be whatever the current rate is, 2.1, 2.2% for 20 years. So hopefully, either way, it would be great for the budget. Either we have a debt service that doesn't start until the project's complete, but we can get the proceeds from the loan immediately because we've already incurred some costs that are eligible for reimbursement. So if we were the state were able to issue a funding agreement, we could turn around and get some money coming in that would basically erase that $940 right off of next fiscal year immediately.
So that's the type of information that's embedded in this proposed budget. So what you're seeing is a worst case scenario, but the reality is if the state, which we have no control over, gets its grant house in order, then we've got some positive cash flow coming in because we've already got grant applications out there, and it will fund a big chunk of what you're seeing here, and it would reduce that deficit. But we'll get through this presentation and we'll show you how this might work, shake out.
We can come back. You know, this wasn't meant to say, hey, let's talk about Columbia Ditch or let's talk about this. This is just the top 10 that's included in here, and we'll be back to it. So,
Isn't the Phoenix Lake already in the grant?
That's our share.
Oh, okay.
So there's no way
next
to
year's.
take that cost.
Okay, so that's just our net cost. Okay, got it.
So sewer, same thing. You know, the dollars aren't as big here, but again, that top one's just design permitting. The total project's going to be, you know, how much?
15 mil, plus or minus.
So again, this is just in perspective for talking about fiscal year 20's operating budget needs for next year.
Again, we already talked about the water and sewer CIP during the CIP workshop, so this was just a reminder of the top 10.
What's a flush truck?
Hydrovac.
Okay, so when we're flushing the lines instead
Yes.
of letting it run down the
Is that
street,
what you park out in front of
we're
my
putting it
office
in a
on?
truck. Yeah.
Every so often?
Yeah.
That's pretty regular.
So I'll do one more slide, and I think it's a
over
good
my
place
house,
to quit.
you know. It'll take-
Okay. So last comment I had before we break for lunch on this slide is the proposed budget and the operational and capital costs identified are a direct result of the 2015 Prop 218 process, in which the board adopted a 5-year program of incremental rate increases for customers. And so, you know, what I've been kind of trying to infer into here earlier is that when we did that rate study, you know, we had in there certain capital items, we had in there certain reserves, we had in some other goals and objectives. And up till now, for the last 4 years, I think we've really kind of abided by that and followed it. But I think it's important for the board to recognize that when that was done, it included a loan or a balancing factor in there. So that rate study was not based on a balanced budget, was, you know, that we keep talking about in here. Now, of course, we look into leverage. We always look to leverage. Everything we do, every day, we're looking to leverage to do that. And, you know, we've been pretty successful after the last 4 years, and we've really made progress. But I think it's important to point this out as we go forward with the rest of the presentation and get to the actual discussion about the operating budget, that this is all within the context of what we promised the ratepayers and what our plan was that was adopted.
Well, at the same time, the rate increase doesn't go back to where it was 5 years ago. We still have those incremental increases, so we have that. We've handled a lot of the CIP. So next year we're going to have that highest rate in there. So when we look at if we have to do any additional rates or what we've got to do from that standpoint, we're still starting from a higher net basis than we were 5 years ago.
Right, it's cumulative. Well, let's take a break. I think, what do you think? We're about halfway through the presentation, problem solving. But we definitely want to really give you a summary slide of what the breakdown of how our expenses exceed revenue.
Keyword.
And then what some of the big knobs are and what some of the solutions might be to get us through this upcoming fiscal year. So Steve?
All right, so we're going to jump in. We really got one more slide before the summary, and then we start talking about options on here. This slide's just as to reserves. Again, it comes back to the rate study. The rate study in this budget proposes to save $1.2 million into the water operating reserves and $97,000 into the water contingency fund. The 20 budget also proposes to place approximately $513,000 into fiscal year 20 into sewer operating and into sewer operating funds. So there's a total of $1.9 million that we could, that's included in this budget to contribute to these reserves. So, the big recap here, the summary, and I tried to fit it all in here, so hopefully you can still see it. We have a water fund, we have a sewer fund. And, you hear all this talk all the time about a balanced budget. And so if you look at the bottom line, you say, hey, it's balanced. There's a net zero. Everything's great. But, really what's important to note is the line right above that on water side has $3.8 million planned financing. That's how you get to zero. On the sewer side, you said, oh, that's great. They don't have any planned financing. Well, if you go up a couple lines in sewer, you see there's 1.5 million that we're essentially taking out of existing capital reserves for sewer. So back to what I said on there, we went through all the budget process. We did that. The total revenues we already looked at, the total labor split between water and sewer, the services, debt service, about $600,000 to get to our total outflows. And there's our net before capital. So right below that, we talked about the 9 million in capital improvements, 6.3 for the water and 2.7 for the sewer, which leaves us with the net after capital of 2.4 and 960,000 negative or a deficit at that point. Then we said, the previous slide, we want to put the monies into operating reserve and contingency fund, and then take out of existing capital reserves for sewer, leaves us with the 3.79. So before we get to the next slide, it's kind of like, well, as your finance director, what's our options? One option is we proceed with this. We have a $3.8 million deficit. Prior boards have adopted deficits, rather large ones. And we look at during the year, how best can we address that? I think it's important to note that the board previously adopted the 19 and 20 budget with a planned financing of 1.7. So between the last time we were projecting this, and that was before 19 during fiscal year 18, we were planning on a deficit of 1.7. Now it's gone up to 3.7, principally capital projects. Some of it in O&M also went up. But that's one option. That's one extreme. The second option, the other extreme, would be we want a balanced budget for this year. And to balance the budget, we would basically need to cut 3.8 million for water and 1.5 if we don't want to use sewer fund reserves. But again, the capital reserves are there for that purpose. Again, that's another option. You need to decide, are we going to cut labor? Are we going to cut services, supplies, CIP? What are we going to do? And then finally, the third option is just to reduce that planned financing to something less.
When we originally looked at the CIP, weren't we sort of anticipating maybe over that 5-year period as much as $8 million in loans?
Right. And, originally the CIP, our kind of target goal was about $5 million a year in water. And some years have been less, and this one's obviously a little higher in there. But the rate study did go into it not being balanced in that it was looking at a loan of $8 million. Now, the only thing I'll caution you before we go to the next slide, that, if you do a bond issue for a particular project, which is typically how you do it, right now we have 59 capital projects. So you're typically not going to go get a loan for a bond for $9 million to do 59 projects. It just doesn't work that way. Ideally, we're going to do one big project, and that's how we get it done. But, it's like I remember when the high school was going on, everybody said, oh, we're going to get a bond, we're going to get a bond. Well, you have to repay that bond. It's not like a grant. It's not like free money. If you're loaning money, you're putting down. And where we've really struggled the last 10 years is trying to right the ship. Put some money into reserves, not have that deficit balance, still do the improvements we need to. But, our days are so chock full of just making sure our 15,000 households have water that, that's really what we fight with every day. And so, it's easy to say, well, we haven't borrowed $8 million, let's go borrow $8 million. But I've been of the opinion that if we can control expenses, do what we need to do, and really be strategic when we go out and get those loans, whether it's a bigger loan or not, and not add to it. So kind of like if your credit cards are always maxed out, you can go get a new credit card, or you can try and pay down the credit cards you have. And so that's kind of where we sit right now with Ed being here and everything else. I mean, Ed looks at this and says, so we need to cut. Absolutely. And I caution him that, again, boards have adopted something different in here. There may be a middle ground, maybe what. So this just segues into our big, our real conversation with the board here. What I'm calling alternatives, options, choices, whatever else. I'm just throwing them out in categories. These are no particular recommended actions. These are just management providing the board with what our observations are right at the time. So if we look at one of the main components is revenues. What can we do with revenues? One of the things we're already working on is going through all our real property and seeing, do we have surplus real property? Now, we don't see this as an immediate solution to our budget problem, because at the same token we're looking at surplus property, we're looking at also purchasing property. So it might just be a wash. Also, my understanding, I haven't done it, but my understanding is it's not something we could just do in the next 30 days. We'd have to go through the appraisal, the analysis, the noticing, the advertising, the sale. And then the end result is, how much money are we really going to get out of the surplus property? But again, I'm trying to throw out every alternative, every choice, anything that could help if we want to reduce that deficit. If our goal is to reduce that deficit or eliminate it, what can we do? And I'll go through these quickly and we can circle back and discuss them any way we want. I threw a bullet on there for grants. Well, we're looking every day for grants. And I know I'm hearing the board say, there's people out there who know better than us and do that. But from my perspective, the water industry is very unique, very specialized, and there's certain funds are available and other funds may or may not be available to us. And I think our guys are probably the biggest experts as to what's available and what we can get. Now, if a new funding source comes along, a new Prop 68 comes along, anything else, then absolutely we need to be looking at those things. But historically, we know. We go to the funding fairs. We do this. Most of the water agencies across the United States are in the same position. So we will get some grants. Which ones and how much to be determined. Finally, there's loans. We talked about that. There's a wide variety of loans out there. Water couldn't afford its share of the hydrovac truck out there. So we did a lease financing for water share. We could do that on vehicles, some of these hydrovacs or whatever. And then there's big ones. We could go do a bond issue to do Sierra Pines or do regional. So I just throw it up there for that discussion purposes. Labor. I firmly believe that it's taken a long time for us. We went from being staffed to being understaffed to now I think I would say fully staffed, but Don will probably cringe. Yes, we have some positions that still need to be filled in the budget, but we're not proposing any new positions for this fiscal year. And so when I put labor up there, I just wanted the board to be aware of OPEB. And OPEB is really our retiree health program. Okay, if you haven't heard the acronym a million times or talking about that, but we have a retiree health plan in effect. And over the years, that plan's been modified, been reduced, been changed. The boards constantly, we brought to them actions we could take. But as it stands right now, this plan, the contributions by the members in the districts may be amended by the board. The board previously adopted an annual pre-funding contribution policy for a 10-year phase-in to the full actuarial determined contribution. When we first started out in the plan in 2009, the goal in the adopted plan was to fund it 100%. It's kind of like retirement. If you fund 100% over time and the stock market's doing well and everything else, eventually it'll pay for itself. Well, the problem is stock market falls, the health cost goes way up, it gets out of whack and that. So we started at 100%. In 2012, we had 4 new board members who said, no, it's 0%. So we went from 100 to 0, and then when the board changed again, one of the board members said, no, we need to get back to 100, but we can't do it overnight. So they implemented a plan where first year we would do 10% of this annual amount we'll contribute, 20% the next year, 30% the year after that, because this was a promise made to the existing employees at the time. We want to make sure we can provide it and meet those promises. And so the goal was over 10 years, we'd be back to that 100% funding, not knowing what the cost of insurance would be, not knowing what the stock market was doing. For this budget, we're up to 60%. So I just throw it out there that, this is an option or an alternative, that 60% could be more or less. In the long run, if you're fully funded, it's probably going to cost the district less money. But we still have to pay our budget each year to get there. And so it's not like we're going to go get a loan just to pay this unfunded liability down. Now, I think it's important to note when we talk about this, there's also what's called pay-go. Pay-go is essentially the retirees who are already on it right now. We're paying their health insurance. Now, we have continued to pay that, and it's built into this budget. In the meantime, we're contributing money into this trust that can solely be used for the retirees' health insurance. That trust right now is up to 6.8 million. Okay, it's not on our books because it's not ours, but it's consistently been going up. It's performing well. We're making our contributions. However, the net actuarial liability right now is, as of June 18, was estimated to be 10 million. So we're still 10 million short. We could, if we said there's desperate measures, we got to do something, we could take that pay-go out, which I said was about 650,000. We could take it out of that trust. But then you're kind of defeating the purpose of the trust to fund that future liability. Just throwing it out there so you all know. I don't see it, I'm not recommending it as a solution because, again, if we have a plan to address unfunded liability and all of a sudden we go to 0% or using pay-go, we're going to be back to where we were. Jeff?
You said the amount was 10 million?
Unfunded.
Unfunded, and, okay. So,
No,
so
you said the total amount was
Net.
10.
yeah, you said the total was
Did I?
10.
I thought I
And you
was saying
said
net
the-
liability was 10.
The actuarial liability is 10, and we have a balance of about 6 point something. So, because you
The
did.
cash is 6.8, so the total
about
liability is
six.
16.8.
16.
Our unfunded liability is, yeah, I apologize. I said that.
Okay. Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So we're 10
And,
short.
you know, and that's, the actuarial's done every 2 years. It will be done this year. It tends to change dramatically because it's based on mortality rates, actual employee makeup, health insurance projections, you know, all that stuff goes along with it.
So a little clarity. So the actuarial total liability is 16 or 10?
17.
Okay.
One more question.
He's going up by a million every
On
time you ask
one of your
him.
first slides, you
wouldn't ask
had
him anymore.
It'll be 18 next time, you know, don't ask.
retiree health, is that what this?
That's that pay-go, 630.
Okay,
So the 630 plus the percent worth, the 60%, it's another 600,000 there, about 1.2.
so that's trending upward year after year?
So right
By
now, the
10%.
adopted policy is that 10% difference. And that 10% difference runs about 80 to 90,000 each year. So each year, our operating expenses are going to go up by that 80 or 90,000, pending any other changes.
When we were originally looking at this a couple of years ago, weren't we projecting that by the time it started going back down, that it was going to hit a max of around 22 million?
I think you're right. I'd have to double check for sure. But we'll have another one after year end here and get an updated value. But I'm not recommending this by any form or fashion, and I hope nobody out there is looking at this saying, "Oh, they're going to cut OPEB." No, I mean, I think it's a promise we made to the staff. We've changed. We've done vesting levels on it. We've changed to the minimum PEMCA contribution. So we've been reactive the whole time, and as the makeup of the employees changes, that changes as well. The real driving factor on this thing, unfortunately, is the cost of health insurance. You know, I tell people all the time, when TUD was formed, our health insurance was $200 a month for full family. Right now, it's close to $3,000. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't take 100.
200. I want to make sure they knew it was.
Thanks, Abby. I mean, I'm still staggered by that every time I say it out loud. But anyway, okay, I'm going to keep going, folks. Where was I here?
Yeah, I'm enamored with Obamacare too. Yeah, so.
Lost it. Uh-oh. Okay, give me a second here. We'll reload. It's nothing on your end, is it, Melissa?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's go. Should be F5. Hopefully we'll get back to it. All right. So we talked about the labor. The next one's O&M. Obviously, we talked about all those categories and everything else. I'm just going to call out contracted services because it was at the top of the list. Ed loves to talk about big knobs. Okay, so here's some of the big knobs. In this budget right now is $300,000 for a lobbyist. I put new there. As far as I know, we haven't had a lobbyist before. I've heard talk from board members about it, from Ed about it, but it's one of them. The interceptor we talked about, $300,000 contractual service for the interceptor plan. That's the one that's kept me awake at night. I don't know if you guys were there when they gave their presentation on the interceptor. I mean, I just don't know how we can't do this and find out what we actually have rather than delay it or defer it. We said earlier, we have a rate study in there for $100,000. Again, I'm not recommending we eliminate any of these. I'm just giving the board some alternatives as far as big knobs.
Is Interceptor Twain Hart?
Yes,
Yeah.
Swain Hard Interceptor
When it comes
plan,
down to grade?
for them to come out and evaluate the condition of it, what the recommendations might be, what the findings are.
Cool.
Rate study, 100,000, that's in there. Could that be delayed, changed, internal, external, all those sort of things? We also have the MOU. We need an MOU. It's coming up. We're going to do that. Right now, this budget includes $85,000 to do the MOU. We also have in there both some fees for engineers as well as attorneys related to FERC.
This has to do with the PG&E acquisition, and we're just throwing a Hail Mary out there because I don't know if it's 500,000 or 50,000. So we know one fact, we're going to have to walk every foot and inspect every inch of these 100-year-old facilities to verify condition and value the asset for a purchase and sales agreement. So that FERC number is just a Hail Mary. We know there's a cost, but what is it? Don't know. It's probably going to be more, to be honest with you.
So just a couple more, and then we can have more open discussion unless anybody's got burning desires. What this one is, and this is one we may want to circle back to, but part of it is looking at revenues, looking at expenses, looking at CIP. And so what this represents, remember we had the top 10 before? Well, I went to Eric and Don separately, interesting enough, but then I talked to both of them at the same time. And I told them, if you absolutely needed to delay or not do this year, what projects would you put up there? Now, remember before, some of these may be phase one or whatever. Eric was really looking at what's out to bid already, what has to be done this summer, what can't be done. Kind of picked off some of the high dollar ones. And Dawn kind of looked at from the perspective of, well, it's not just the high dollar ones. There's also some lower dollar ones that are on there. So, again, we can come back to this if the board's saying, well, maybe we should, do we want to keep CIP at the 9 million? Do we want something less? But these are I don't know, maybe there's 15 up there or something else. And if we did that, it'd be the 2 million. Now, you might say, why is sewer on there? Well, the ones that are on there for sewer are those that are really for both. And so we just allocate those between the two. We're not proposing any specific sewer projects. But again, those up there, these are the ones that your staff, at least these three sitting here, would throw up. A couple of them, I confess, I put in, but the other ones were theirs. So we can come right back to that as well. Another last slide before we start into discussions.
Oh, those are the ones we proposed.
Yes, right.
Last slide before we go to discussions is just so we lay all the alternatives on the table, is that we talked earlier about funding this reserve. There's two types of reserve that were in the rate study. One's called an operating reserve and one's called a contingency reserve. The goal of the rate study, and it's best practice, is you do have these type of reserves for us, but the operating reserve was to represent 90 days of operating expense. The contingency reserve was to be 2% of non-capital plus that OPEB payment we talked about. So what I'm showing here is that at fiscal year 18, we had 1.5 sitting in it, and this is just water, okay? If we go to fiscal year 19 budget, we're scheduled to contribute $657,000, and in the budget, per the rate study, we're going to do another 1.3. So you might say, hey, our total operating reserves at the end of this year is going to be $3.4 million. Well, if we don't do that at all, that's kind of eliminating our deficit, isn't it? Well, I take issue with that in that part of the rate study was for us, it's not a best practice to not have a reserve. And so we wanted to get there. If we complete this, what we're proposing here, this fiscal year 20, we will have achieved those goals of 90 days and 2%. When we end with 3.4, I think the rate study had it like 3.3 or 3.7. Okay, so I really think that represents us well as a district doing the right thing. Now, maybe the following year you might say, oh, we got this catastrophe. We need to access these reserves. But I don't think we're at the point in the budget process that we want to take these reserves. I think it does much more to have money in those reserves. And again, I'll remind you, history repeats itself sometimes. Part of the reason water has no reserves is because they were spent previously. Our operating costs aren't going to go down until we complete some of these big consolidations. And even then, costs may go up in different areas. So if we use reserves today, we're going to be hard pressed for operating next year, unless it's something special, specific, anything else.
Not to mention, we have the whole state water board issue coming out in the next several weeks.
Yeah.
And we're being warned to have a good water rights attorney. That is not a good omen.
So just
Those
to,
reserves will be necessary.
I've given you everything we've got from management and where we sit. I don't know any of us are comfortable saying we need to do option 1, 2, or 3. I think, I would love to have the board's discussion and Ed's guidance and everything else here, because I really view it as, I think this budget's well put together. We put in a lot of work here and everything else. I think it's realistic, achievable, and it is what it is. But I do not like having a $3.8 million deficit at the starting line. Personally, I'd feel way more comfortable being like 1.8 if we could cut $2 million out of it. Now, does that $2 million come out of where? I am not sure. So there's a lot of people out there who said governmental should always have a balanced budget. You need to do that. I think given the rate study, given the last year, the rate increase, given everything we got going on right now, I think the solution's somewhere in the middle. Ron?
So, where are we at with the loans that we are already paying on, like the West property and stuff like that? How soon are these going to drop off, be paid off?
Yeah, we've been paying them off regularly right now, and I'd have to pull up the audit schedule, to see that. And that will be a page in the board's budget report in there. We've got a couple of them dropping off in the next couple of years. Nothing's dropping off during this budget period. I have the actual loan payments in there. They're about $600,000 on that.
So it's not a huge, that's a big.
If they dropped off tomorrow, it'd be $600,000.
Okay, so that's not gonna be, okay.
Right.
And then,
We don't have a lot of loans.
No.
Yeah.
No.
so then let's say, I'm just throwing this out here just for discussion. Let's say that the board okayed the deficit. How is that going to get straightened up during the year?
Good question. We had adopted budget deficit last year. I think it was about 300,000 or something of that part. It's something we look at each month. If there's one particular thing coming up that we felt would be a good idea to get a loan or do something like that, we do that. I tend to look at loans as last resort until we have the reserve set up and everything's there. Usually we know pretty quick. I mean, last year was kind of an odd one because of some of the outside stuff. Jamestown, Reservoir, Stent project was still wrapping up, some of those other ones. But if we adopted it today, I wouldn't go out and try and borrow $3 million tomorrow. It would be more a kind of monitored as it goes. What's our operating expenses? How are they panning out? Is it a really hot summer all of a sudden? We're starting earlier. Do gas prices go through the roof? Are we going to get that 50% SRF on Cuesta Heights? Is the state finally going to start paying us back? Are we going to get the permit for Phoenix? So as we go along, it would be as it stands now, the existing loan policy is anything we would incur would go to the board for adoption first. So if we got to the point we said, look, we're not going to make it, we need this much money, what are our options, where can we get it? It would be an item for a board topic. I don't know if we need a workshop necessarily, but Ed and I would work through what our alternatives are for financing, what the terms might be, what the repayment plan would be, how we could handle that. Because that's the thing, like I said with bonds, if we go out and incur this, we have to show the ability to repay. And in the past, that kind of was hurting us with sewer or water, before we had this rate increase. The outside people would look at it and say, you don't have the ability to repay. You're struggling with your operating expense. So, adopting the 3.8 I'd be concerned, but it's not, oh my gosh, I got to do something today.
Well, that was going to be my final question is, at least on this for right now, is how, I mean, none of us like running a deficit. Let's just be real about it. But how, I don't know what other word to use, but how comfortable is staff starting down that pathway this year?
Well, I would say the deficit's equal to your reserves. So if we use reserves, you have a balanced budget, but you don't have your financial recommendation and policy of a reserve. And then, there's some uncertainties that we're looking at, which is how successful we're going to be with some of the grants. That could reduce that 3.8 million deficit by half. But then, and I don't know what's going to happen with the state water board. When we end up litigating, having gone through that before, I mean, I hate paying attorneys like anybody. I'm paying one right now, by the way, personally. But, you're looking, I think Jesse Barton would need help. I would not go to the state water board with a lawsuit without another water rights attorney that would be the lead, and Jesse would help. And we're looking at probably $400 to $600 an hour, and you could easily chew through $500,000 to $1 million. And I know a couple years ago, Mountain House and BBID, we spent $1.5 million in about a year. And I hope it doesn't go that way. But we've done everything we possibly could to avoid it. And now we're like everybody. We're just waiting for the answer to be published. And then if we don't like it and we think it's going to impact reliability here in this county, then we have to file a motion with the state. It's called a motion for reconsideration. And that goes through the executive team. And that won't cost very much. And then we have to basically appeal. And then they'll respond to that appeal from the executive team. And then we don't like it, then we have to file with the board and exhaust that administrative remedy. And then if we don't get a favorable decision from the board, now the board's the governor appointed officials at State Water Board. There's 5 of them. And I think it's more favorable than it's ever been right now because Felicia Marcus is gone. You have Joaquin Escoval, who talks the good talk, but we'll see if he walks that talk. But there's, what was the young engineer's name that came from consulting?
Oh, Sean McGuire.
Sean McGuire's on there now. We have DDD Adama, who's a friend. So there's maybe 3 good votes right there. So maybe we, instead of a lawsuit, we exhaust our administrative remedy and get a favorable decision from the board. I don't think we're going to get it from the executive team. But if we don't get it from the board, then we have to file, and then we have to appeal, and it goes before a subset of the State Water Board, because they're kind of like the fox that guards the hen house, and there's been proposed legislation to separate. So we have to appeal to the board, who is the regulator. So you're appealing to the regulator. And it's a bit of an awkward process, but that's what was done and how Mountain House and BBID spent $1.5 million was just, and they got and State Water Board dismissed it before it went to Superior Court. Because if you get an unfavorable decision at the board level, then your next remedy is Superior Court. And that's where we felt we would get a more fair hearing because you're outside of that regulatory body, but we didn't have to go there.
What's the average long-term interest rate right now? Around 2.5, 2.7?
For borrowing?
Yeah.
It depends on the program and it depends on the medium household income. For instance, USDA, which is a nice program to borrow through because they allow you to amortize the debt up to a term of 40 years, which is kind of nice, which is kind of the life cycle of infrastructure. They base the interest rate on medium household income. So if the medium household income, I forget what it is for Tuolumne County, it's like $43,000 a year. So if you're at $43,000 a year, you're pretty close to the market rate for USDA, which is probably the 4.5% to 4% range. And then if you're in a disadvantaged community, it can drop significantly all the way up to and including grant. And then SRF, similar, but they will only do a 30-year term, so your annual payments are going to be more, but you can get what's called principal forgiveness. So if you're in a disadvantaged community, they call it a loan, so it's just a shell game, but then they give you principal forgiveness, and some or all of it could be 100% grant through SRF.
And I think you need to keep in mind too that, it's not like we can just borrow for operating expenses.
No, I
It
understand.
could be, I know you do.
Oh, you
It's
can't-
project
yeah.
related.
Yeah, you
It would
cannot
come out
borrow.
of this, if we did that, it would be against the CIP side of it.
Yes.
And then leave
Yes.
the other revenue for the operating side of it. At the beginning of the meeting, you also said we averaged, over the last 10 years, about $3 million a year in grants. So, that's still one of those things out there. In looking at your budget, and I know the work that you guys have put into it, I know that you can't just sort of wave this magic wand and go, okay, here's $3 million worth of stuff that's just all fluff in this deal. I know you didn't bring it to us with a whole lot of fluff in it to begin with. So that's what I'm struggling with right now to look at going forward on this.
Yeah, so on the O&M side, I know Don and Steve worked real closely to fine tune some of that O&M, and I think you guys reduced some of the O&M expenses by about 700,000,
Several hundred thousand.
several hundred.
Yeah. For instance, we took some monies out of contractual services. We took a fair amount of money, and my distribution superintendent doesn't know this, but I took several $100,000, reduced the meter supplies. He wants to be very aggressive because he understands that when we put in auto read meters, it just improves his efficiency with his labor in his department. But trying to be conscientious and spread this wealth around, we took several $100,000 away from that. But it's still high, 400,000 is still pretty aggressive, but it's, anyway, so.
And some of it, you're right, Ron. I mean, there's no fluff in here. We're not hiding anything. There's some specific things that I might question. Ed says, no, we need to do this, whatever. But there's no fluff. I think it's conservative in there. There's some of these projects that, in reality, are they going to happen or get done this year? Are they the highest priority? But, when you go to cut, if we were to cut, we need to, look back at some of the alternatives we showed up there to make those decisions.
I know I got to become a better communicator, because there's been a few statements today that have been said about me that I'm not sure I've ever said. So it must be me in my poor communication style. So Steve, if I understand you correctly, there's some projects that I said need to be there. I'm not sure that was my intent that they need to be there, but that I've heard from board members that this is some of the direction they wanted to go, and we put it out there transparently so that you understand. For instance, like the rate study. That's probably an easy one that I'm pretty sure we don't have to spend $100,000. I mean, the last 5-year study, you did it pretty much in-house. Dave Andrus is good. He knows what he's doing, and I, there's an expense associated with it, but it wasn't anywhere near $100,000. So that might be some savings right there. Not to mention, next year's an election cycle. I'm not sure what your elected officials' nerves are for doing a rate study with a potential rate increase just before the November election. And I'm sensitive to the politics of that, but really that's going to be the board's decision about what you want staff to do.
If I was going to look at any sort of rate increase, I would be more inclined to just try and bring the sewer up so that it hit the threshold where we can go after the grants to go after that funding.
Well, it's going to be more complicated than that, and that you're exactly right there. But what I mean by being more complicated is that we're going to know a lot more about PG&E come the end of this year. And there's going to be, if we're successful, there's going to be a purchase and sales agreement, and either TUD has to pay, or if we're good negotiators, PG&E is going to pay TUD to take a failing system, an underperforming system that requires a subsidy. So it's possible that TUD gets paid to take the system, kind of like EID getting paid. I think it was $17 million for the Drum Spalding project. And it's like, oh, great, we just acquired a hydrogeneration reservoir project, which is an asset, and we get paid $17 million to take that asset. And then what's that old, and now for the rest of the story, what was his name?
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey, I always liked that guy. Now for the rest of the story, EID was required to pay $80 million in deferred capital improvements to bring it up to standard. And these systems that we're talking about are 100 years old, and PG&E is not being proactive about maintaining these facilities. I'm hearing it's basically a fix it when it breaks type O&M scenario. So, this is our water supply system. It's important, and if we take on that requirement, we're taking on a huge liability. But then we really don't have a choice. It's our water supply. And so when we talk about the rate increase, it's going to be beyond just getting the wastewater side above 1.5% that gets us eligible for SRF and USDA grants. We're going to have to think about some of these other obligations that are coming down the pike that we just at this point in time, staff doesn't have the numbers to be able to tell everybody what it is.
So I think though too, as we continue down that road, possibly obtaining that infrastructure, that we need to also add in and make part of the conversation some of the things that will really be a plus to us in the long run. And what I'm thinking of right now is like, it's all old, 100-plus-year-old stuff and all that. But like with the flume, right now, if we were to lose that, it's PG&E's and it's not going to get rebuilt. I can almost guarantee that. I don't know what would force them to do that, especially with them in bankruptcy. But if it was under TVD's wing, then it would be eligible for the
FEMA.
Thank you, FEMA funds. And so then we would. I mean, these are positive things. So we need to look at the whole picture. And the other thing that I wanted to ask, Don, one of the things that Steve brought up was labor, and I used to know, but I don't know anymore. There's been a lot of changes out there, and I haven't been keeping up with it. How comfortable do you feel about the level of amount of staff and workers and so on? Because I know for a while there, back several years ago, that was a real bone of contention out in the operations, that they had a bunch of holes in their, that they had a bunch of, and so where are we at now?
Well, so my answer is going to be spread amongst not just operations, but district-wide, right? The whole, from administration on down.
Right.
I think some of the things I've learned, and I think we've learned, is we have some needs. We've talked about them in here, somebody specifically to write grants. I think that would be beneficial, right? So I don't pull away from the workforce that we have. Operations really, really leans on administration, engineering, other staff to help us do our job. So anytime we pull away from administration or engineering to do something that wasn't in the plan, you pull away from our ability to lean on them for that. So there may be some, maybe not in operations per se, but an administrative type person to help operations and help engineering to take on not just the existing projects, but these other things that I know are coming. You say we don't have a good crystal ball, at least we have a crystal ball, and we know we can look back on history and we know what we've learned, both good and bad, to know that in the next year, in the next 5 years, we're going to take on projects that we weren't planning on. So when we do that with our existing staff, let's say they spend 30% of their time working on this project that we weren't planning on doing, That means 100% of the project that we were going to do isn't going to get completed. I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, we have some needs, but to say that it's just in operations, I think is not true.
Well, I got a little more information. So we have hired and for operations more than anywhere else. There, from what I understand, we're pretty much back to the pre-recession levels, which is good. I think it shows a commitment to staff. And so we're probably pretty close to being where we need to be. But I think, again, I'm very careful and strategic about adding FTEs because once they're here, it's a pretty serious commitment. And so where we're at in terms of staffing and operations, I think we just track carefully and see how the recent hire is doing over this upcoming year. I know in terms of admin, we were talking actually about adding several FTEs. I think in engineering, we could seriously use an engineering technician. We're using a registered engineer for what I would consider to be a lot of technician duties. And one rule in management is you don't pay at the $100 per hour rate if you can hire someone for $50 per hour. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done that could be done at the engineering technician level that would free up, say, a higher level staff person to do other higher level work. And I think in HR, we were looking at an assistant. So there were several FTEs we were looking at, but because of the deficit, we decided we're not going to entertain recommending adding those FTEs this fiscal year.
Well, I think you filled in some blanks for me, so I appreciate that. I think where I was going with this ultimately was, is there a way to maybe contract out some of this stuff so you don't have a FTE, number one? And I'm not suggesting you haven't thought of it. I mean, I know.
Well, that's the contractual services line item. And yeah, well, that's a big part of the strategy that we're employing moving forward to leverage additional extension of staff to get some of this work done.
Right. Well, and I want to give you an example. Some time ago, I heard this, and I was kind of flabbergasted that one highly trained employee would, I don't know what the best word is, but I'll say routinely would end up with a stop notice and have to go out and hang it on the door. And, to me, that maybe could be like a job that would be contracted out to someone that was not a...
I mean the water shut-off notice?
Yeah. Okay. And, that would leave the highly trained employee to be doing what they were supposed to be doing in the first place.
No, we're always trying to think of creative solutions.
Oh, I know you are. I didn't mean to make it sound like you weren't.
I want to clarify what I've said about grant writers. I know we have two really good grant writers here, and I'm not proposing doing anything that would interfere with what they're doing. What I'm proposing is we get a couple of them to come in here and tell us what they are willing to do and how they get paid and how they, get grants as a contractor, not as an employee, to free up some of their time. And I've been trying to do this for the last year and a half, and so far I've just been getting nothing but lip service. And I know how they work because I've worked with them. And I know they have time to do things that our full-time staff don't have, and all they do is look for grants all day long, right?
Yeah.
So I would like to have one or two of these firms come in at no cost and just tell this board how they operate, what they can do, and what they think they can do for us, and have them also have a conversation with our full-time staff to see how they can work together and what they feel, how they would feel about it. Because it's not going to, we're not looking to
Right.
do away with them.
I get you. And I think that listening to the discussion today, which we went into a lot of detail, but I think it was helpful because this is an area that we need to really clarify and work on. I think it's a good idea. Let's bring some of these people in. And I know I've already given Ken Payne a green light to move forward. We're working with Ian too, Rick Lind. And then there's the lobbyist line item. That $300,000 is not I mean, it's not a lot, but it's not a little amount either. And so my thinking there, having worked with lobbyists in the past, is that 300,000 is not exclusively for a lobbyist. It might be one, two, or several lobbyists that are strategically focused like a laser on certain activities. And then if we're going to do this, just like we pay the annual dues for CSDA and Aqua, which is valuable, but it's only as valuable as the amount of time you exercise their use. For instance, attending the conferences and networking and learning, going to legislative days, and really exercising the full benefits of those annual membership dues that we're paying. Because if we don't go and attend and take full utilization of those membership opportunities, then we're just paying dues. And they're working in the background for advocacy, legislative advocacy for us, trying to protect us. But there's a lot more that we can get out of it if we exercise those membership benefits that I think we are doing. That's why I think it was healthy to be at the legislative days. But similar with the lobbyist, part of their ability is to interact with your board to see what your priorities are and focus on a marketing program and develop a leave behind that I have staff working on as we speak that's about 90% done, that a lobbyist could definitely weigh in on. But help your board develop a legislative advocacy and lobbying program, custom fit to TUD, that you can take to Sacramento and Washington, D.C. to get some of these big dollar items we're talking about. And that's a part of this grant. They may overlap with some of these grant writers you're talking about, but I think it would be helpful to hold, I think it's going to be more than one workshop, and these formats seem to be good for your board because you guys can open up and really talk. But I could see this occurring over 1, 2, or 3 workshops where we bring in prospective lobbyists, prospective grant writers, and interact with them about what the priorities are and how they're going to custom fit what they do to help us do what we need, what we know needs to be done.
And I think what you're talking about, I think, is right on, but also to add with that is the discussion that you and I had about possibly seeing our representatives on maybe a quarterly basis.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because that would be a perfect.
What Director Regan's talking about is what we really talk about legislative days. We have legislators. When was the last time any one director talked to our local legislator, both at the state and at the federal level, about our TUD priorities? I'm asking a real question. Has anyone talked?
Oh, we had McClintock here.
Last year was McClintock.
Last year. So the message that I think what Ron and I were talking about and what we talked about at legislative days was, we don't want to go talk to our legislators when we have an ask or a need or a negative message. We want to go talk to them. I don't know. We didn't come up with an exact time frame, but once every quarter at least. Even if we don't have a need or an ask, let's go sit down with Assembly Member Bigelow, Senator Borges, Congressman McClintock, and our senator would be Feinstein.
Well, there's 2 of them.
Two of them. Let's go talk to them on a quarterly basis. Even if we don't necessarily have a need or an ask, let's develop the relationship. And that's really kind of the message I've been exercising both at the county level, but extending it to the state and federal levels so that we have that relationship. And then with a lobbyist, and we target a very good message. The big dollars that we're interested in, I know, are the regional water treatment plant for both wastewater and water. I still think Maloney's is a huge opportunity. That's why Ken Payne's with us right now. We still need a transmission line from Columbia to Sonora. These are all big ticket items, but I think that they work well at the lobbyist level when we're dealing with feds and state, because they check a number of boxes about consolidation. I'm all about using keywords you see in the governor's Water Action Plan and the federal, integration, diversification, consolidation, disadvantaged community. We check off a lot of those boxes. And so if we have a very sophisticated, fine-tuned lobbying program, I think it's going to augment what staff's already done and leverage the tens of millions that we need. I mean, we can get 5s and 10s, but if we can get leverage that for a 3 times or maybe 10 times multiplier, that's where we need to be. And I think we have that opportunity.
It's just as much work to get a small grant as it is to get a big grant.
So the line item for lobbyists, I mean, your board hasn't commented whether you support that, the rate, do you want to keep the rate? Do we just keep it all in knowing that, at the end of fiscal year 20, we'll come out okay? Because we're not going to move forward with the rate study unless we went to the board and said, okay, do you want to do a rate study? And if so, do you want to do it in-house or do an RFP for an outside rate consultant? Last time I did a rate study, we did go outside and we hired, there's several in the state that do most of them.
NBS.
And we hired NBS, did a fantastic job from beginning to end. It was $50,000.
Well, first of all, I really like the idea of giving the board an opportunity to really explore some other avenues like lobbying and some of these other areas where we will benefit. It takes time, it takes building relationships, but it's clear that there's, some payoff. So that is a lot, I think, kind of new and different, even though we had Bob Reed before, and rather than fuss over OPEP. We finally got that on track, and I'm really glad that it's kind of a moot point. That's not even on the table, but we want to go in this larger horizon because these are really, really complex issues now. There's not any clear places where one begins and one ends, they're just all convoluted these days, and there's program complexity. And as an example, Mountain Counties is looking at franchising, like we did with getting Dan Kelly, the attorney, to hire a PG&E water specialist. Who was that, Ed? You were there at that meeting when Mountain Counties when Dan Kelly came up with a water rights attorney to help all the other smaller members.
Oh, right. Yeah, we actually followed through with an agreement, and that was Reed Smith out of San Francisco.
Yeah, and so that's a way to help pay for our attorney costs and get a big bang for the buck collectively. Mm-hmm. And the other one is Mountain Counties is seriously looking and has looked at Bob Reeb for 5 hours a month, but he would work on behalf of our interests. Because the pressure is coming from, they may not say we want your water, and water rights are only as good as the paper they're written on, but there's a whole lot of pressure coming from a lot of areas that Bob Reeb is very sensitive to, and we aren't. And so that's an opportunity for Mountain Counties to help by hiring him and being accountable to our specific Mountain Counties issues. I'm in no way saying that is a replacement for what we're asking for here. Right. I'm just reinforcing the point about the importance of having lobbyists to get those big ticket items.
So I think, if I understand, listening to the board, you're okay with the $300,000 line item for lobbyists, because that's going to enable you to have these series of workshops and have the funding to be able to hire one or more to meet your needs.
I agree. I think we do. I think the time dictates it. The issues we're facing with PG&E and these other issues.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we'll keep that, and
Well, I wanted to add, now does that include getting those experts here to talk to us about some other?
Well, my goal, and I push these guys, I say, hey, you want a job? Come interview. And we're not going to pay for the interview. So I think there's enough interest out there that they'll come in and give a presentation and interact with your board to talk about priorities with no charge. The charge will be, if you're interested, then you would enter a contract with that particular lobbyist or grant writing firm. But we'll set up a series of workshops in the months ahead, once this budget's adopted, that would allow your board to talk about these issues and develop, because you don't want to, the last thing I'd ever recommend is go throw money at a lobbyist and then walk away and let them do whatever they do. They're going to burn through the money and you're not going to get anything for it. So if we're going to hire these guys, we got to have a crystal clear plan for moving forward and what's the expected outcome. It doesn't mean it'll be successful, but we'll at least have a plan, and we'll work hard to make it, increase the probability of success. So we'll do that. Sure. The rate study, I don't know if your board has an answer. Do you want to keep it, delete it? Keep it for now. We don't have, see, my point was, just because we keep it, yeah, we know we have a deficit, but we're not going to move forward with the rate plan unless we come back to board and said, hey, we want to do the rate plan. Because you would have to authorize this to proceed with a contract. So
Have to spend it.
we don't have to spend it, so we can just keep it for now. The MOU, I'm hoping that there's some options that are a lot less cost, and we're looking at, and that's why we have the labor management committee, so that we can minimize that expenditure. And so it's a line item, but it, like Jeff just mentioned, it doesn't mean we're going to go spend $85,000. The last MOU you got, it was almost $200,000. We do not want to repeat that. So let's go back to the other CIP slide. So, I mean, part of me is comfortable going with this 3.8 million deficit, and doesn't mean we're going to go spend it. I think we're going to get grants.
Can I?
Yeah.
Just manage expectations here. The only current grant application we have that is for a capital project that is in this upcoming fiscal year is Cuesta Heights.
Yeah.
And so there is, honestly, if we were to spin up and submit a grant application, the lead time is over a year with the state right now. So even if we went and applied for a grant for every project in next fiscal year, we're not going to see the grant funds.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute.
I
mean, for instance, Willow Springs, right at the top. I guess you could delete it from CIP, or you could keep it. I think there's some pretty strong opinions on various angles of this. But isn't my understanding Willow Springs is that it's a lower income? Is it defined as a disadvantaged community?
I don't know if it's a DAC community or not.
I don't think it's a DAC.
It's not. Well, so I mean, what percent design are we at? 0. See, so that's the run-up time that Eric's talking about.
We know where we want to replace it. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's right.
I mean, we know where the project is. The project's defined. I'm looking at Dawn. We're trying to, honestly, we're trying to accomplish a lot more at this district through on-call services. That's been a real high priority of the board, it seems, the last 2 general managers too. So with Willow Springs, the reason we think we could spend $524,000 this year is because we're going to do a very expedited, streamlined design, and we're going to move to construction. I mean, we really don't need a lot of engineering, design, and overhead to replace an existing pipeline. It's already in the road. There isn't a lot of property acquisition. There's not a lot of CEQA. We've just got old pipe that needs to be replaced. So that's why, but it also doesn't lend itself very well to a grant.
Like USDA, but you got the overhead with USDA.
You won't see it this year, though. So
right.
You will still have that expense. You might be able to recover that cost in subsequent years, but you can't bank on that.
But these are, I don't want to pause too long on this, but it does get complicated, and that's why if we do have a legislative platform and we have, say, a lobbyist going after some big dollars for various projects, because Willow Springs is tops $5 million, and that might be an interesting project if it's catastrophic leaks all the time that the state and the feds might be willing to throw a lot of money at, whether it be like a 40-year term amortized loan at low interest, or even 30, it might be better than spending our ratepayer dollar $500,000 per year over 5 years. And a grant writer or even our staff could work on that. I'm not saying that I have a best recommended direction for that, but just trying to shed some of the shades of complexity regarding how do we try to get to this balanced budget versus fund it over 5 years.
Is there any way to couple that into fire protection for the area? Because that's all undersized pipe, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It's possible through OES, pre-disaster mitigation. I mean, these are the things that take a lot of time to think carefully through. And I will tell you, having worked through OES and pre-disaster before, they have a very rigorous grant application process that requires not only the full-blown comprehensive grant, but also a cost-benefit analysis that you need to complete. And it has to show a positive benefit cost or they're not going to fund the project. But
when I had that discussion with the director yesterday, he heard what I was saying about let's stop being reactive, let's start being proactive. Yeah. And he just really bought into that. And he wants to talk to me and see what this thing is that I have in mind. But that would be perfect for that. That's a death trap in there, because what is it? It's a bunch of 2-inch lines.
3 and 4 inch and 2 inch galvanized. 3 inch transite.
Mm-hmm. Hello.
Is that standard operating procedure when you do that replacement? Do you upsize lines generally? Is that
Absolutely.
you plan for that?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
that's pretty much everything, Jeff. I mean, not only are they old, but they're undersized.
Yeah, that's right. I would assume
Almost
so.
every case we're upsizing. And that was the problem with Black Oak Casino and the Tribe is they need larger diameter lines. Mm-hmm. And that might be an OES PDM.
Eric, you had indicated that, we wouldn't get any funding this year, but we on some of these, we should probably have a pretty good indication of whether they would be granted or not.
With the deficit.
We,
That's right there.
Thank you.
yes, I think if the board selected out of these projects, which ones it was a high priority, and we worked together and we submitted through outside grant writers or our own staff, if we were able to get them in by the end of this calendar year, which I think is reasonable, the state usually wants to see before they'll commit to funding that the environmental is done and the environmental. And like I said, Willow Springs isn't a real big environmental. So we could do that, and then we could wait 6-8 months and find out, yes, it looks like you're going to be funded. But the state has really slowed down, at least in the Safe Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which is what we've used the most. So we may know by the end of 2020 if some of these projects are going to be funded, but I didn't mean to be negative. I'm just saying for the next fiscal year, the only one has possibility, I believe, to actually have monetary savings for the district or to impact the budget is Cuesta Heights. Because we've had that application into the state for a year, over a year, and we still have no idea when they will fund that. It's just the nature of how slow it's been with their financial software integration. They've said that they're slowing down on issuing funding agreements until they can get all their software fully deployed.
So just being sensitive on time. We got about
We gotta talk. We just have to finish. I know you're going to get someplace else for some other thing. I'm not sure why.
Because
I'm finding extremely frustrating that for 85% of this time we've done a lot of talking. We're getting right down to the crunch, and we're going to run out of time and not finish a conversation.
we can have more workshops done.
I got to get to work.
So I don't know. I think we're getting pretty close to where we need to be. I don't know how comfortable the board is with, say, a $3+ million deficit, but it doesn't mean, even if you adopt a budget with that it's going to be spent. And you've heard that some of the money is going to result in grants that are going to offset that. Not to mention you have your reserves that you can pull from. But again, we're not going to go just spend the money just because it's adopted. It still requires staff to come to your board to approve, say, a line item for the lobbyist, hiring a lobbyist, or hiring a rate study consultant, or doing whatever it is. So these are just placeholders in a budget, and then by the end of the year, either you approve it or you don't. But you still have some of these in here that I don't know if you want to comment on, and I know it was a little controversial at the staff level, but we were looking for an all-wheel drive SUV. Right now, we just got a couple of old Camrys. They're in decent shape, but what age are they? 07s?
05 and 07.
05 and 07. And to be honest, we had a problem this last winter. Well, some of what we do, it helped to have a lift back rather than just a four-door sedan. So we had that in the budget. Another one was the landscape demonstration garden. There was the front and the side. It's a grant, and we have it in here. That's the Tuolumne County Resource Conservation District Rainwater to Irrigation Landscape Project. I think we would have to pick up $67,000 as a local cost share of about a $300,000 project. That would put in rainfall or native plants front and side with rainfall capture tanks. There's mixed emotions at the staff level that, I know I'll pick on Don.
Yeah,
cut.
Pick on me. I say to cut
So-
$3.7 million deficit. And
Some of those line items are in there, and I just want to pick on a few of the more controversial for your board to see what your thoughts are on
Well,
some of these.
I understand that, and I could pick a few out myself. I'd hate to see that generator go, but CIP as a whole is I really hate to see us start cutting that back. I mean, to me, that's what that rate increase was for, a big part of it, and also, this is the nuts and bolts of our system. This is what our ratepayers pay us to do. They pay us to provide potable, drinkable, safe water, and you could make a case for almost every single one of those items that directly relates to that. I'd just hate to see us go through here.
You have some you would delete?
I could live without the SUV, but I'm not the one driving it. But it doesn't directly relate to putting water in the ground out there. Workspace partitions, I don't know what that means. Does that area out here that is yet does that mean we're getting additional ones, or are we going to recycle the ones we have when we get our new carpet, or is this,
we're reusing the partitions when we get the new carpet. This is that open area
okay,
by the bathrooms.
okay, the rainwater irrigation landscape project. If we're going to cut something, I'd rather see that go than start digging into that Willow Springs distribution improvement or some of these other things. I think it's just priorities, and I'd be willing to sit down with somebody and give you my 2 cents worth.
Well, that's why we're here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, take out the SUV, take out. Let's see, what else?
I would say defer it to next year.
Yeah, next year. The rainwater irrigation landscape project. I don't know enough about that, but that doesn't seem
But you
mission
still gotta get
critical.
up to the
Maybe it
generators
is. If
and
it is,
pull
tell
the-
me.
It's not mission critical. It's just a native plant demonstration project in your front and side. It's gotten a little sloppy,
get to-
along with some rainwater capture tanks.
I mean, we're 3.8 in the hole.
It's
here.
not mission critical.
That's
We
what
gotta
we're talking about PG&E,
stick to what-
and then getting
what's
more
really
generators for you. You still got to get to them.
What's that 60 kilowatt portable generator for non-departmental?
Well, it's mobile. It's a trailer mounted generator that is mobile that we could take anywhere, and we're generator short. But if OES is going to throw money, and I've already talked to Don to put together, I want to know if we want to be 100% up on generators, how many does that look like? What about SCADA telemetry and communication? I know Groveland CSD, Pete was at that. He says they got $500,000 in ask. And if that's Groveland CSD, I told Don, you better come up with a $1.5 million ask. And I don't know if OES is going to come through, but if they do, then we could delete that line item. But I would suggest we pick up another generator if OES doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. We need to stay in there with that one. Can we get by without the petitions till next year? You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could. I got staff that's asking for this, that, and the other, but I mean, if push came to shove, we could probably get by. I mean, at the end of the day, it's 13,500.
We're dealing
45.
with peanuts on the three.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's not a lot.
Yeah. And loans are not on the topic of discussion.
Well,
No,
I think we
loans
do.
need to be on the.
But I think that the loans and the bonds and some of these other financing methodologies need to be a part of the workshops when we bring in the grant writers and the lobbyists to talk about some of these other opportunities.
$2 million loan, for a 30-year would add about $140,000 a year. So, I mean, that might be the way to at least look at it from, seeing where we shake out, but look at a portion of a loan for right now and move forward with it where it's setting and see how we evolve.
Now, the way it's proposed to you, we're saying we're going to get some form of financing for $3.8 million.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you call it loan, borrow, whatever, I mean, that's what's presented to you.
No,
That's the deficit. We don't, I don't think we need to talk about loans because they'd obviously have to come back to the board for approval.
I see.
What we're looking at here is, are you okay with that 3.8? Or do we want to
What
cut?
bucket we gonna take it out of?
Right. Do we wanna cut?
And loans are typically designed for a specific project. So let's say Willow Springs, we would go after a $5.5 million loan and we would pay, it would just be for Willow Springs. Now, a bond could be different where by the time you go, bonds have a lot of overhead and they're a lot of work because we have to hire bond counsel. It's a very rigorous, complex process. And rule of thumb, I forget the number exactly, but you don't do a bond for anything under 10 million. Even a $10 million bond's considered low. Most cities and utilities, if they're going to do a bond, they're looking at $50, $100, $500 million bonds because they're so complex. You're not going to do it for a small project. So what I suggest, if your board's interested in a bond, we really have a bond expert. We really strategize where we do, say, a $20 to $50 million bond to make it worth our while, and you knock off probably 10, 15 different projects here.
I think we see how PG&E. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think I was going to say what you were going to say. This is all about positioning and knocking some of this stuff off and keeping our reserve, but also getting us in a better position for acquisition. Is that where you were going? Mm-hmm. Go ahead then.
Yeah, I think if a bond does come on the table, I think it's more related to the PG&E acquisition than any of the CIP programs.
Or maybe the regional treatment plant consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
Something big.
It's got to be big.
Yeah.
I got one more question about that Canyon View pump station. Is that just the generator, 51,750? It's not pump station and generator, right? It's just a generator.
That's a generator.
That's a permanent mount generator, or is it a trailer style?
That's a permanent one there.
Propane power.
So Canyon View pumps up to Rainbow. Rainbow supplies all of the water to Mueller.
Yeah.
That might be another one. If OES came through, we could check off.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question from an audience member when
Sure.
it's time, because we're
Yeah.
running out of time. I like the idea of a loan type thing or for a substantial amount. Even bonds, yes, they take a lot of time, but actually we're shifting resources though from scrambling and trying to going through a whole other bond gauntlet so that it will pay off. So we're just shifting mental headaches, okay, to a different headache. Hopefully it'll buy us more. So I kind of do like the idea of that rather than living with the deficit. Because if we could bite off a chunk, that's something, we haven't done before. So So the question from the audience is, okay, if I read this
Sure.
now, okay?
Yeah.
All right, okay? All right, so of the three, deficit loan bond, which will have the least negative influence on grant obtaining ability? Is that
Question.
okay?
It's a good question.
Go ahead if you want to take a shot at it.
Well, I'm thinking of the application process for the state Safe Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and they want to see design, environmental, and then the third leg is financial ability, because they want to know if they're going to give you a loan that you can service the debt on that loan. And they have a Steve maybe can help me out. They have some ratios in there.
They do.
I think it's like maybe
It's
one
debt to
point-
income
One and a
ratio.
quarter.
1.25, 1.25. Okay. I think that it may cause them pause, but if we show that we have revenues that aren't covering our costs, because they're also concerned not just about debt service, they also want to know that your infrastructure that you build, you can continue to maintain. If you're running a deficit, how can you argue that you're really going to maintain what you
Because
just
they're seen as a
constructed?
way out of the deficit.
I think if we got to that point, we would have to demonstrate that we had financing or something else in place. But usually, you don't get to that point in the grant process with them until they've looked at your environmental and everything. It's like the last step. So we would have some time for Steve to communicate with the staff at the Division of Drinking Water Financial Assistance to provide that information. But yeah, if you just gave the grant application and they said, well, wait a second, you have a $3.7 million deficit in your water fund, how are you going to pay for a loan? Then that would be a problem. So we would have to reconcile that.
And on bonds, if the board's interested at some point strategically for a large project, I don't think, does TUD have a bond rating right now?
No.
So before we can even go get a bond, we got to get a bond rating. And I don't know if you've been through bond underwriting, but it's a pretty rigorous process. They're going to parse out every little piece of financial information and risk and liability associated with TUD, Tuolumne County, and the operations. Because they want to know, at the end of the day, if they give you a bond rating, that's kind of message on the investor street that if it's a AAA, which we won't get, but we might be an A- or a B+, what your credit worthiness for paying that off would be. And yeah, that's a very rigorous process, and they're going to look at they're going to do more than what the state USDA does, and it's going to be rigorous. And that's where all these, and Steve talks about financial GFAO recommendations and best practices. You better have your 90-day reserves. You better have contingency funds. If you can't check those boxes, you're not going to get bond rated, and then you're not going to be able to issue bonds. But at the end of the day, investors are going to want, they do like utilities in the bond industry because one of the most reliable sources of revenue are water sewer rates. So that they typically do get fairly decent bond ratings, but it's rigorous, and we just need to show that we have what I call the TMF, the technical, managerial, and financial capacity to run a professional, well-run, sophisticated utility.
Aren't we going to really need to do that when we start talking with PG&E? I mean, we're kind of a little fish in the pond unless we get something going on there.
Well, I mean, there's some tough discussions ahead in terms of how we're going to acquire and pay for those systems. And we don't even know, part of the frustration is the chicken egg issue. I can't tell you what the cost is going to be yet because we're still trying to get through, well, I can't even talk openly about it because it's non-disclosure agreement, but,
Having the county tied in, would make a big difference too.
But could we get started on it? I mean, would it eat up too much staff time to get the process at least started so that when
the process for bond rating,
right?
that's something that we could talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you,
If we get hit in the face with this, all of a sudden we don't have anything ready to go. It's,
Well, and
How much staff time is there in getting this done? I mean, I don't know.
it's,
I'm not, this is a whole nother discussion. I mean, we're trying to adopt the budget for fiscal year 20, and you guys are going so somewhere else. I'm back to
more
being
issues.
confused, I'm sorry.
that's okay, I'll get them unconfused. I think we're gonna do all of the above, and we'll bring back, we're running out of time. I'm sorry, Don, I do have other things going on. And it's been a healthy, good discussion. I'm not sure if we could add much at this last minute.
I'd like to tell Steve, I understand that you're frustrated, but everything is interrelated, and we need to talk about all this.
No, I'm not frustrated, Ron. Again, I'm hearing so many mixed messages here. And, our concentration right now is on this operating budget, this fiscal year. And I appreciate all your values and what you do, but I think,
What do you need from us today?
what I need from you today is that, I told you all what our recommendation was, general managers weighed in, that sort of thing. And I really see three options. At this point, we've got a budget in front of you. I think it's a realistic budget. A lot of work went into it. Option one, we adopt it with a planned deficit, planned financing of $3.8 million. Option two is we cut $3.8 million out of it and we have a balanced budget. Option three is somewhere in the middle. We cut something and you need to help us what that something is, whether it's CIP or something else. And that's really what I'm looking for from the board today, so we can
Didn't
go
you say
forward.
your option 3 is getting it down to 2?
My recommendation to the board is I would like to get that to $2 million.
Well, I think we can get there because we're not going to go out and spend the money. I already took note. I mean, if I can reiterate, the demonstration project and the SUV, does the board agree delete those? Or defer it to next year? I mean,
Defer what?
we may have a tough budget next year too, so we can at least defer it and we can think about it then, but that's 45.
What'd you
and
say, defer it? I'm
The
sorry.
SUV, that's 45,000.
35.
And then the demonstration was 67, so 70.
100,000.
That's 115,000. I mean, that's something. But I mean, the other things we're not going to go spend right now. It's just in the budget.
I got a couple more questions.
Well, Barbara was
I'm sorry.
up.
Go ahead, Barb.
So Steve, I just thought this was a workshop to present the fiscal year 2020 operating budget. But you want something you actually want a recommendation.
It's a budget workshop. I would like the board's direction and input. Again, what I've heard from you a lot of times, Barbara, is you're just given something and you're expected to sign.
Consensus
I'm not
or
doing that.
motion?
I'm telling you all, here's what we have. I'd like the board's direction. You've
Consensus
talked
or
about
motion?
grants, you've talked about fires,
Well,
you talked about all this other stuff. Really what I'm looking for is that here's what we got. And the way I see it is either we go with what we got or we cut it completely or we cut somewhere in the middle.
We're looking, staff's looking for
Interaction.
direction.
Thank you.
We're not adopting this budget today.
No.
We're
June
gonna
11th.
We're going to bring this back June 11th, and we'll have a resolution for the strategic plan, the CIP, and the budget. That's where you'll have another opportunity to talk about it. But what Steve and staff's generally looking for is direction. So the more clarity you can provide now saves us time on June 11th.
I got a couple questions.
Please.
First of all, what's our 90-day? What's our cash on hand right now for for your 90-day goal?
If we do those reserves, we'll get to that. In water, it's that
one more year.
3.7 thousand. We need this one more year of contributions to get that reserve.
Okay, so we're
We
close.
wouldn't cut the reserves.
Yeah. Okay. So okay. All right. And then what's our total revenue? I'm looking for the ratio of our the 3.8 versus our revenue.
24 million. Are you talking water and sewer? or just
Everything.
water?
You can go
Yeah.
control
23 and a half.
So our deficit's about
And then, again,
15%.
from an operating standpoint, from an operating standpoint, 15.
Okay.
From an operating standpoint, we have the net before capital of 3.8.
Yeah.
Then our capital is 6.
to me, just to me, and I'm one person on the board. 3.8 is high. I think we need to come down in the middle somewhere. I don't know if we have to actually balance it, but I think we need to get it
3.8's positive.
down. No, but
If you're looking at the net, the 3.8 on the bottom.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yes.
Deficit.
Yeah. Thank you.
I tend to agree with you. I think we need to get that down, cut it in half, somewhere in there. Yeah.
I'm not sure, do we have the capacity to expend $5 million in water CIP over this upcoming fiscal year?
I think there's a few things on that list, Steve, that you put up for consideration that, I mean, I could offer up, and I want Don if he disagrees, but there are a few things in there that I think could be deferred. None of those I think we want to get rid of, but for instance, the Matlow Pipeline and Turbidity Station, we've been wanting to do that project for years, but the reality is we're in the throes of permitting, and that has uncertainty to it. And we won't be in construction this year, so let's say we get the permits this year, we put it out to bid in the spring of next year, you really aren't in construction until summer next year, which then we're in the next fiscal year. Mm-hmm. So that one easily could shift over on the table to the next fiscal year, which is $346,000. I think the Pedro Y intersection, last time we checked with the county, their construction, that is really dictated by the county's project at the Pedro Y. The rate the county's moving, we won't need that until next fiscal year. You can shift that over.
Can I ask you about that one real quick? Besides, I mean, it's only $69,000 I see, but how much of that is, how much staff time is that going to take in addition to just the $70,000? Or is that $70,000?
We've already invested all the staff time. The design is
all done?
We're
Okay.
just sitting there waiting for the county to say go, and then that money hires the county's contractor to do our utility relocation. Yeah.
But I don't see big dollar items on this particular CIP list.
Well,
Well, the
340.
Tech Pipeline is another one. Like, we would really like to,
Yeah.
we were working on it, but if it had to shift
We're
over,
at 400,000.
it could shift over. That was just one phase of it. It could defer. The Cedar Ridge Upper Tanks land acquisition, we don't have in our 5-year CIP a new tank in Cedar Ridge. We want to get the land now because land is a finite resource, and when you see an opportunity, you want to get it. But that could be deferred too. We don't have a willing seller quite yet, so that's got a lot of unknown anyway. So right there, I mean, if you threw the tech guide in there, you've got 750. You're up over 800,000 that you've deferred. I'm just trying to help you out.
Why would we throw the tech guide in there? I mean, you're talking
Throw it
about
out.
pulling the tech guide out?
Defer it.
Oh, defer it?
Moving it to the
What do you
right.
think about that? We were just,
Well,
That's a
it
high
kills me.
maintenance item.
We've moved it every year for 5 years.
well, maybe we ought to leave that one in then.
But we got to move something. I mean, this is
Yeah.
the reality. This is the reality.
What would you
You
have for
know,
Willow Springs? Sorry, I know.
that is half of Willow Springs.
No, that's a tenth of Willow Springs. But can we get $525,000 in the ground in between now and June 30th of next year? That's the
That was
question.
my question, was
That
capacity.
was your
Yeah.
question. Right.
Well,
So I mean, those are
that's
the
a different conversation, but I think so. Of the two, I really would want to consult with Dennis, right? Of the two, if he had to move one to the right versus the other, which one? You know, just to try to give you some explanation as what techite, when the techite line blows, it's a thin, very thin wall piece of pipe that came around in the late 60s and 70s, which, by the way, Calaveras was part of some sort of a
It was a
class
action lawsuit.
and so Calaveras jumped on it and paid to have it all ripped out of their stuff. But Tuolumne County just didn't.
Well, they
Too
got
busy doing other
some
stuff.
reimbursement from that.
But what that does is 3 or 4 times a year, it's a major blowout on the side of a hill, and hundreds of people are affected out of water for upwards of 12 hours. On those 12 hours, usually it's in the worst of conditions at night in snow, and our crews are out there 3 or 4 times a year.
Yeah.
That's an impact. Now, Willow Springs is completely different. 6 or 7 times a year, every year, for the last 11 years, we're going to go out there and fix a leak. Sometimes 3 feet from the one we were there 2 weeks ago.
When you say a leak,
Over and
you mean
over.
you mean a complete fracture or something like
Sometimes if it's on the AC line, it's a complete fracture. Other times it's on the galvanized, it's just a pinhole leak.
Okay.
And, you know, again, it's just a,
So what I'm hearing you say is Techite's is more important.
well, I'm gonna ask I would really,
Well, 3 to 4 times a year or 6 or 7 times, you know. Pick
Yeah,
one.
but it's devastating. Sounds
Yeah.
like those. I'm trying to think of the ratepayers too, and how many people are affected, and you know the problems that it causes. I don't know.
I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean,
Ron?
I in the end, I'll ask Dennis. But
As much as I agree with Director Kearns, I'd like to throw out that and I hate deficit spending, but I would like to see it pretty much kept intact, and because I have high faith in staff and also what you were talking about, that some of these things may not even get done in this coming fiscal year. So I think it's going to work itself out over the long run. But that's just because it's just like what you two are just talking about. That stuff is important, and it's going to save us money in labor and overtime and everything else down the road. Let's just get it done.
And I'm not sure we have the capacity to do all
Right.
Willow Springs and Techite, but yeah, I don't disagree.
And
So
I just want to chime in too. You know, I'm the finance, and I told you what I'd recommend, but I'm no expert like these guys are. But I would rather fine $900,000 than to have Dawn drop off those top two.
Right.
I just would.
and we'll find some money.
I tend
So
to.
for the interest of time, I think what I'm going to recommend, because it's about that time, Don,
I hear you.
that we will send an email to the board of this PowerPoint presentation for you to look at your leisure. We'll send out the CIP PowerPoint. Is it on our website? We should have that on our website.
You know what, we should send the whole CIP because the PowerPoint just had a couple
Yeah,
highlighted projects.
we'll send, well, but the problem is it's in Excel and I don't know how
Well, make a PDF
Excel,
out of
yeah,
it.
make a PDF out of it. So we're going to send out an email of all of this material so that you can read it at your leisure. And I think we need to put it on the website in PDF format so that anyone can look at it. And then we'll come back. And again, we can sit down one-on-one between now and June 11th, or we just talk again at the June 11th. You'll have an agenda item for adoption, strategic plan, CIP, and budget, and you can bring your comments there or bring them ahead of time.
Okay, just one more comment. The Mate Lot pipeline. That's the one you thought we could live without this year. Is that?
Can't wait to hand them out.
So that would give you some,
Figure if I gave them.
what is it? So the Matlow Reservoir,
Well, I just wanted to make the statement that and the other items down lower that we took out were already about 400,000, right, Steve?
Right.
So we're 25% of the way there to cut our deficit in half, right? My math is right. Yeah. Do we have to make it all up in CIP? Can we do something else?
oh, I'm gonna work a little bit, I'm gonna go back to so yeah, there's some more work I can do in O&M.
No, I mean, leave CIP alone after that and
Yeah.
go after it somewhere else.
Somewhere else.
Yeah.
Well, the Big East reserves.
Was
I also think with
Well, the
with the
lobbying
referrals,
is
grants,
reserve
and then some loans
payments,
on
the
this,
biggest.
we can close the gap on that pretty much and see how it sorts out.
I hate to borrow money. I don't have to. I hate doing it.
Yeah, I just want to say the way you sort of unspooled some of those timelines, I think gave a lot of depth to the deficit. You know, that it's kind of a paper deficit, but when you really apply real life timelines to those things, they tend to kind of sort themselves out. And so I really appreciate it. It gave me a huge level of comfort.
I am concerned if it's true that it's going to spill in or be a project next year, that if we are interested in bond underwriting and loans and so on, one of the things we have to do is submit our budget and audits as a part of that process, that we look as good as we possibly can. So
Yeah.
we, maybe on some of these, we push into the next fiscal year where you think it's going to spill in anyway. That reduces that deficit down to nearly balanced. And maybe even we reduce that reserve payment, because that was a big knob.
So I'm just trying to add to the conversation. So by moving it from this year to the following year, because the following year is no different than this year. When I'm done talking about Willow Springs, I'll be talking about Brentwood. When I'm done talking about Brentwood, I'll be talking about.
But I wasn't.
So I'm just trying to.
I wasn't talking about Techite or Willow Springs. We were talking. Eric brought up a couple where, even if we're pursuing the permitting on the Matlow, it's next year, and those where it's not going to be next year, even if we can have it in this budget and show the deficit. Or my point is, well, we can't get to it next year. Let's just do what we can to queue everything up, and it'll be in next year's. And that deficit will be more balanced, and maybe we consider some smaller payment to reserves.
Can I say one more thing, just for context and help and understand? So 5 years ago, when we were doing this first CIP, a lot of these footages for the Techite and the Willow Springs, we were just completed, and you'll correct me, Eric. Don't be bashful or correcting me if my math's horrible. I know where you're going. So we had just completed the Big Hill intertie from Big Hill to Columbia, right? That added up to about $140 a foot. Bingo. So in 2015, I applied this $140 a foot to these numbers, and that's how we planned the budget for the next 5 years. Today, we're paying $250 a foot. So it just compounds. It's staggering what's happening to us.
You're the doom and gloom. Dude.
I am sorry, but I got to touch this every day. And really, I'm not. I'm in here having pizza with you guys. Those guys are really out there, and they're kind of counting on us to help them do their job. And I know everybody wants to and is doing that, but just understand it's a real pressure.
Yeah, I agree. We'll get all this information out to your board via email. If the file size is too large, we'll do FTP, Dropbox, and we'll get it on the website. And don't be shy or bashful with your ideas.
Right.
So when do we take action on this next?
It will be at the board meeting, first board meeting in June, which is June 11th.
Which is